Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Scion Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What if Deku becomes Archmage Monk? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Tsuyu could be forgiven for the thought that this might be the worst field trip in UA history. It started off fine. She and the rest of the first years in the Heroics major class at the university were taken to a facility on the campus meant for rescue scenario training. She and her best friend Ochako were quite happy with this, both having planned for years to become rescue heroines after graduation, and having the exercises be taught by 13 was a huge bonus. Ochako was actually vibrating in excitement when she saw the hero walk out the facility doors to greet them, and while the space hero wasn't her personal favorite, they were in her top 5. 13 gave an impassioned speech about learning to use their quirks and other skills to save lives, as well as learning the restraint needed to not cause further harm in disaster scenarios, which was received well by everyone in the class except Todoroki, whom Tsu was certain had some issues to work through before actually becoming a hero, and Bakugo, who Tsu is 110% sure was a bully who had never been told no in his life by anyone who wasn't family that he didn't immediately beat into SBMSN. The bad part happened when they walked in with Professor Aizawa and 13, having been told All Might would be joining them shortly. She saw 13 hold up 3 fingers when asked where All Might was and caught Aizawa grumbling about the height of irrationality, so she assumed he would be there either in 3 minutes, 30 minutes, or 3 hours. Either way, when they had all entered the building, the lights flickered and the doors closed behind them, while a massive black and purple cloud swirled into existence by the large fountain in the middle of the facility. Someone, Kirishima she suspected, made a comment about fake villains. Bless that Rocky himbo. Aizawa decided that it was time to stop pretending to be ready to fall over and gave orders to the students and 13 before jumping into a growing crowd of what had to be hundreds of villains making their way through the portal, which had expanded in the few seconds since it had appeared. She barely caught sight of a man wearing severed hands and a hulking beast with what looked like an exposed brain walk out of the portal as it began closing, but was already turning away to get to the door to help open it and get out as instructed. Naturally, they didn't make it to the door. The portal villain showed up in front of them, and while he sounded like he had good manners, the content of his speech was frightening. They actually believed they could kill All Might. A man who had shrugged off nearly everything that had ever been thrown at him as far as Tsu knew. She didn't get to continue thinking on the subject before she fell through the floor when the villain got upset at Bakugo and Kirishima tried to jump him. She eyed the water below her with a sigh of gratitude that she wasn't sent to the Flaming Mountain or the Blizzard Zone, and noticed 2 of her classmates fell with her, so she shot her tongue out to grab the one with smaller mass, Mineta. She grimaced, and once they hit the water she flew through the water towards where she saw the other body hit. As she got close to her rapidly stabilizing classmate, Shinso she thinks, she noticed a shark mutation quirk user trying to eat the young man, so she put more effort into her kicks and shot into the villain's temple with a vicious drop kick that knocked the shark man off to the Shadow Realm. She meant unconsciousness. She got both men onto the boat where Shinso and she worked out a quick plan to escape their situation, involving Shinso hypnotizing a group of more than 20 water-based villains and Mineta handing out his sticky orbs so the villains could capture themselves. Tsu finished up with her part of the plan by leaping closer to the docking platform UA had installed on this man-made lake for maintenance purposes. Once she was sure there was no one else in the flood zone, she moved to the shoreline with her classmates and watched in horrified fascination as the beast smashed Aizawa's head on the concrete with a sickening crunch sound, Aizawa's arms clearly having already been broken, and if her eyes weren't playing tricks on her, then her teacher also lost a lot of skin on his elbow. She was fighting hard to stay quiet and to calm her queasy stomach at the sight. Something Mineta was having far more difficulty with. Why was he in the hero course again? Before she could get any further, she was interrupted when the portal villain reappeared beside the man with the hands all over his body. Shigaraki Tamura. The man didn't even look at his accomplice, content to stare at Aizawa while the beast held him still, awaiting orders. Kurojairi, about time. Did you kill 13? Unfortunately, they are only incapacitated. I was prevented from finishing the job by the students who managed to avoid my initial mass teleport, and one of them succeeded in escaping the facility. I fear we need to leave now before reinforcements arrive. The now named Kurojairi explained while staying out of arm's reach from the leader. Said leader was now scratching his neck so severely that Tsu was almost inclined to feel bad for him. Almost. He did try to kill her teacher and classmates, not to mention plotting the death of the symbol of peace. He suddenly paused in his self-mutilation and addressed the new arrival, Kurojairi, if you weren't our exit strat I would dust you now. We can't deal with all of UA's heroes showing up at once, the raid is a bust, let's go home. Mineta seemed to take this statement at face value and was making slightly too loud happy noises that she was ready to push him under the water surface to get him to shut up before he gave away their position. The idea becoming increasingly attractive as she felt him ineffectually reach towards her BRSTS in what she wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt and say was a happy accident, but was well aware that he was reaching for it on purpose. That he couldn't reach her chest due to his diminutive stature was of little comfort as she saw the leader turn his head and make a comment about leaving a few dead kids to break the symbol of peace's spirits. It was only due to the weeks of practice she and Ochako had done at the local batting cage to develop their instincts to dodge fast-moving projectiles that she was able to jump back several meters into the lake with the others as she registered the absurd speed the leader was moving at in an attempt to grab her face with his hand. Likely some sort of 5-point contact quirk, not that she knew what it would do if he had touched her, but she decided to err on the side of caution. The leader scoffed at his failed attempt before grinning at her in a disturbing mimicry of what he probably thought was a supportive smile. Wow, you have some great reflexes there, hero brat. Too bad you're still going to die. Nom dash. Whatever he was going to say died on the tip of his tongue as a light blue portal phased into existence by the fountain, within a few feet of the beast and their teacher. All movement had stopped and everyone was watching the portal and waiting to see who the new arrivals would be reinforcements for. They didn't need to wait long as a few seconds later a man stepped through the portal wearing strange robes over a tight-fitting sleeveless tunic with armored padding on his elbows and knees along with metal greaves and bracers, a sturdy-looking staff on his back and metal plates over his knuckles. The hood was still pulled up over his head and his back was turned to the portal where he seemed to be talking to someone on the other side. Yes, Khadgar, I'll be fine. I've got the new portal spell memorized and should be able to come visit soon. I just want to go see my family first, talk to you soon, and if the spell doesn't work please don't feel bad about me, I'll figure something out eventually. Goodbye, Master, I hope you have an enjoyable time, he said with a jovial tone that Sue idly noted was a poor excuse for a cover-up for how much he obviously didn't want to say goodbye to whoever this Khadgar was. He waved again and the portal rapidly shrunk out of existence as he reached for his staff and stretched while turning around. Now then. Where did I end up? Hope I managed to end up somewhere in Musutafu. Interplanetary portals with no travel anchors are always a little finicky, he muttered to himself before seeing everyone around him and his arms drop down into a ready stance, clearly used to sudden combat scenarios. Alright, clearly I've popped up somewhere at a bad time. Who's the commanding officer for the sides? I'm willing to mediate and hopefully remove the need for further bloodshed. The leader laughed at that, instantly drawing the newcomer's attention. Why would I want a mediator? I've come here to kill that disgusting symbol of peace and as many hero students as I can so that there'll be fewer to hold us back when we move on to destroying society. The man visibly tightened his guard at this while tilting his head in an obvious display of confusion. Who's the symbol of peace? The question was so jarring that the leader stopped laughing and stared at him for several seconds while Tsu's eyes widened in realization. She heard Mineta and Shinso to her sides both mutter, "What? Ha! Ha ha ha! Ha 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 ha." The leader laughed again but far harder. Where'd you crawl out of, dumbass? I may hate the guy but everyone knows All Might. Tsu watched the man's knuckles clench tighter at the name. Obviously he recognized the name but not the title, which she found strange. Ah, you meant All Might. Sorry, but I've been off planet for a little over a decade. My memory about the man is a little faded. The last time anyone talked to me about the guy was when I was 8. He then turned his still hooded head to Kurojairi and asked him, since I'm not getting anywhere with Handy over here, what are you guys actually here for, and is there any way I could convince you to leave peacefully? The misty man seemed taken aback at being spoken to suddenly but answered all the same. As Tamura mentioned, we are here to kill All Might, and if the opportunity presents itself, some of the students and teachers here at the UA facility to reduce the number of enemies we would need to face later. The man regarded the misty villain for a moment before responding, no. Kurojairi flinched at the denial. That's why Handy is here. You weren't given a choice, were you? Kurojairi stepped back, shocked at the words but was unable to object as the man kept talking. In fact, upon further scrying, it's obvious you aren't in control of your body at all, are you? Neither you nor that undead over there. Shigaraki decided it was time to stop the discussion before something happened to break the brainwashing on his accomplice and his toy. Enough. I don't care what you say or do, there's no way we're leaving without killing our targets. He moved to an aggressive stance and was ready to charge the new guy. I'm gonna start with you. You're gonna be dust in the wind when I'm done with you. The man maintained his stance and looked back at Kurojairi for a moment and pointed his forward index finger at him and muttered silence, before turning back to the now charging Shigaraki and pointing the same finger at him called out, "Arcane Bindings." Tsu watched as Kurogiri raised his hand, supposedly to make a portal, but noticed nothing happened and then saw a cage of blue and white energy pop up around the charging Shigaraki that he bounced off of, and several similarly colored ropes of light restrained him with his arms off to the side and held slightly off the floor. "What the hell is this? Let me out so I can kill you, you cheater," the now obviously deranged man shouted before whipping his head towards the beast and yelling at it, "Nomu! Kill this cheating BSTRD." Evidently the man hadn't forgotten about the beast, or did he call it an undead? Regardless, the moment the thing appeared in front of him he pointed at it and said, "Polymorph." The nearly 12-foot-tall thing instantly turned into a half-foot-tall black rabbit that was hopping around randomly on the ground near the man's feet. The scene was so strange that the deranged leader stopped shouting and couldn't close his mouth as he watched his ultimate weapon to kill All Might was reduced to a fluffy critter. The man walked closer to the rabbit and pulled a cage out of a small bag on his waist that clearly wasn't big enough to hold the cage, and ushered the rabbit into the enclosure and then pushed it back into the still too small pouch before raising to his feet again and turning to the villains. "So, got any other tricks or weapons? I don't mind waiting, but..." What? What did you do to my NOMU? What even is your quirk?" the villain leader shouted at his captor, Kurogiri, still attempting to open a portal, presumably now to escape with his boss. The man tilted his head again. "Quirk? Oh, I remember those now. No, I don't have one of those. I was pronounced quirkless when I was 4. Tsu was going to have whiplash from how quickly she was wrenching her head back and forth between the two men. How was that guy quirkless? Misdiagnosis maybe? About the undead though. I have him restrained and I'll work on getting him to a proper containment facility when we're done here." "Quirkless? Stop lying, you a-hole. There's no way you're quirkless. I watched what you just did." The man nodded once. "Yeah, that was magic. I do not, have not, and will not have a quirk. I remember being very upset about not having one when I first left Earth and find them unnecessary." Before things could escalate any further, the doors to the facility exploded open and everyone turned to see a huge silhouette move through the smoke cloud he had just produced, and an iconic voice came through that put everyone at ease. "Everything is okay now?" "Why? Because I am here," came the familiar catchphrase, and Tsu couldn't help but relax a fraction. In the time of a blink, All Might had vanished from the stairs and was now standing by Tsuyu and the boys on the shore, making sure he was in between them and the unknown men, rapidly glancing back and forth between the three and a downed Aizawa by the fountain nearby. "All Might? No, why did you show up when my bioengineered weapon is gone? Kurogiri, get us out of here!" Shigaraki shouted, clearly straining against his bindings. The shouts instantly telling All Might who the more dangerous people were. He'd deal with the third man afterwards. As he tensed his muscles to rush the two villains in order to knock them out, Kurogiri seemed to have finally managed to create a portal again and warped himself and Shigaraki out, with Shigaraki shouting about it not being over and that he'd be back to kill All Might and the cheating fucker sooner or later. With the absence of the leaders, everyone's attention was now on the new arrival, including the students who were managing to reach the central plaza from where they'd been sent. The man didn't seem worried about them though, as he turned to Aizawa and moved towards him. All Might appeared in front of Aizawa in a flash and prevented the man from getting any closer. "Sorry, young man, but I must ask you to stay there and stay away from my coworker. The police are on their way, and if you had nothing to do with the invasion, you'll be free to go after answering a few questions." The man stopped, head tilting again in what Tsu was now certain was his primary way to express confusion. "I'm trying to heal him, All Might, sir. I am a combat medic who has been on the battleground since I was 12. If anything, you should probably be finding any more of your students who might still be missing." He began to walk around All Might after saying his piece, and once he was in front of Aizawa he knelt down and gingerly rolled the man onto his back so that he could properly assess his injuries. Tsu had to turn away for a moment when she saw the state of her teacher's face. Clearly much of it was broken in some way and there was a lot of blood. Aizawa managed to open his good eye and looked at the hooded figure. "WH. Who are you?" he managed to breathe out. The man stopped for a moment before reaching up to his hood as All Might reappeared with the other students and the injured form of 13 nearby. He pulled his hood back and off, revealing green and black curly long hair pulled back into a braided ponytail that hung down his back underneath the cloak. His rounded eyes a brilliant green that seemed to shine in the overhead light, diamond-shaped clusters of freckles under each eye on his cheeks decorated a chiseled jaw and a calm, friendly smile that disarmed everyone around him. "Forgive me. I am Tactical Commander Midoriya Izuku, leader of the United Forces of the Horde and Alliance Coalition and one of the most decorated combat medics on Azeroth. I also hold the titles of Master Monk and Archmage of Dalaran, as well as several more accolades that are unimportant right now. You may call me Izuku. I am here to heal you. Please remain calm and still. I am going to remove the top half of your armor so that I can make sure I'm getting all of your wounds at once." Tsuyu idly noted how handsome the man was and wondered what all of his titles actually meant, but noticed that Bakugo took a half step forward with an unidentifiable look on his face. Before she could get caught up any further in her thoughts, she watched as Izuku carefully removed the top half of Aizawa's jumpsuit and saw just how damaged her teacher's arms were. Once he was done, he observed the damage and gave another reassuring smile to Aizawa. "It looks a lot worse than it is. I'll have you up and moving around shortly. Allow me a moment to check the other patient," he said as he checked 13's back through the hole in her suit. "Ma'am, if you can hear me, I'll be able to heal you up, but you'll have some scarring on your back. While I am a combat medic, I do not kid myself into thinking I'm even close to good enough to remove the scars this wound will cause. We might be able to do something about them later though." 13 managed a grunt of pain and he smiled again and moved to sit between the two injured instructors, and everyone watched as wisps of green mist wafted off of him and began to circulate around the three of them. It was easy to see how quickly Aizawa was healing as his bones realigned and reset, muscle fibers and broken capillaries repaired themselves and the abrasions closed themselves before their eyes. The skin around his elbow was slowly regrowing as well, but it was obviously going to scar. Soon enough the mist began to dissipate and Izuku brought his hands together and a swirling blue liquid appeared between them, which he collected in a glass see-through flask he pulled from a pouch on his waist and handed to Aizawa, who was attempting to sit up. "Drink this. While you don't use mana in the same way I do, you are nearly out of it and you're about 10 seconds from fainting." He then repeated the process to give to 13 as he helped the woman remove her helmet to drink the concoction. Color rapidly returned to the faces and bodies of their teachers as they both managed to stand up with some help from the nearby students. Izuku was going to say something but was interrupted by the arrival of the other teachers from the university and their classmate who had gone to get them. He watched as they efficiently rounded up all of the invaders and prepared them for the police that arrived minutes later, and then noticed the short chimera-looking thing walking towards the teachers and eyeing him up. "All Might, Aizawa, 13. Status report," the chimera said, causing anyone who wasn't already paying attention to him to do so. Aizawa stepped forward. "Dean Nizu." Several hundred villains appeared in the USJ facility with the intent to kill All Might and as many students and teachers as possible to remove obstacles for their future plans. There were, to my knowledge, no casualties. The worst injuries have already been taken care of by an unknown third party who has introduced himself as Midoriya Izuku and demonstrated his abilities as a combat medic. Nizu nodded and watched the man in question pull a green tunic out of a too small pouch and hand it to 13, who blushed at something he whispered to her and quickly pulled the tunic on under the remains of her suit. He was now very interested in this man who seems to have saved his employees. Aizawa continued. "The leader brought what he called a bioengineered super weapon with them that they planned to use to kill All Might. It was as strong and as fast as All Might even when I tried to erase its quirk. Aizawa gestures to Izuku, incapacitated and removed the weapon from the battlefield through a method I could not see. I heard him say a few words and from my vantage point the thing the leader called Nomo was gone. The warping villain Kurojiri was also unable to produce portals for roughly a minute, and he had restrained the leader in a cage and ropes of light until All Might arrived and Kurojiri's portals started working again, so they left." Aizawa then pointed at himself and 13, he then introduced himself and healed 13 and I from life-threatening injuries. Nizu glanced at 13 and All Might, who both nodded and gave their own versions of the story which corroborated the parts where they were both present. He then turned to Izuku and stepped towards him. "It seems that I owe you a great debt for what you've done today, young man. You have my heartfelt thanks for saving the lives of my students and teachers," Nizu said as he bowed at a 90-degree angle. Izuku waited for a moment and reached out a hand to shake the dean's paw. "It was no trouble, sir. I merely showed up on an active battlefield and did what I could once I figured out who the active aggressors were. I still have the undead. Sorry, the Nomu your staff mentioned on my person, ready for captivity. I just want to take care of this so I can figure out where my family is. I haven't seen them in a little over a decade," Izuku said with a fond smile towards the end. Nizu's eyes glinted briefly and nodded. "We should be able to do something about the Nomu. In the meantime, there's a detective making his way over to collect statements from my faculty and students. I'd like it if you could speak to him as well in my office on campus so that we can clear up any misconceptions." Izuku nodded and turned to Tsuyu. "You three are okay, right? Sorry I took so long to get you out of harm's way. I wasn't sure what the enemy's capabilities were, so the best I could do was keep their attention on me and detain them." Tsu was very happy her quirk made her face less expressive, or she'd be blushing right now. Sure, it was just a case of hero worship and she thought the guy was good looking, but she didn't want Mina teasing her later, and she could already see the pink girl watching the two of them interact. "It's fine, Karo. I'm not going to complain about not dying less than half a month into university, Karo." Izuku smiled at her again before being led away along with the staff and a detective. She and the other students watched as they made their way out of the facility and into one of the university's vehicles and sped down the road. Like clockwork, Mina bounced into Tsuyu's personal space and gave her very well-practiced grin. So Tsu. Who's the hunk? Karo. Izuku's POV. The ride to the main campus was a short one. He was enjoying the nostalgia of riding in a vehicle instead of a mount as he'd gotten used to over the last 10 years. At least it was much easier on the butt. He watched the scenery go by as they approached a vaguely familiar building he sort of remembered from his childhood, the memories fading in and out as he tried to grasp them. He followed along behind the group as they arrived and began walking presumably towards Nizu's office, and he was just hoping this wouldn't take too long. He's been looking forward to seeing his mom for years and he doesn't want to spend all afternoon filing paperwork. At least in war there were scribes who were responsible for taking care of that sort of thing, not that he wanted to go back into active combat. He watched as they all filed into a room with a very nice wooden door and found himself being led to a small couch and discreetly surrounded by the other occupants while the detective sat in front of him. Dean Nizu preempted the conversation. Tea, anyone? Well, if he's offering. I'd love some tea, sir. I am a little thirsty as my morning has been hectic. Izuku replied as everyone else either nodded or shook their heads. A cup was poured and placed in front of him on a coaster on the coffee table while the detective looked up from his notepad and addressed him. Hello, I'm Detective Tsukachi Naomasa. I work with the police force as the liaison for UA University and I have a quirk that detects lies. It tells me if something is an absolute truth, a personal lie, or an absolute lie. I have a few questions for you regarding what happened today at the unforeseen simulation joint. Could you please explain how you got there? Izuku nodded and took a sip of the tea, enjoying the flavor, and nodded towards Nizu, who returned the gesture. No problem. I arrived through a portal. Not one of Kurojire's portals. One made by my teacher and father figure Khadgar. We weren't sure where I'd end up but knew it'd be somewhere within 200 kilometers of where I was when I left Earth when I was 8. The detective, who up to this point was listening intently, stopped scribbling in his notepad and froze, something everyone else did as well. He regathered himself. I'm sorry, just to verify, you left Earth when you were 8 years old? Yep, on my birthday actually. July 15th. I've spent most of the last 10.5 years on a planet called Azeroth. It's entirely possible that Azeroth resides in another dimension altogether as well, since the mana here is a little different from how it was where I was. Izuku confirmed, taking another sip of his tea and reaching into his pouch for a bowl of noodle soup. Anyone want a bowl of noodle soup? Made it myself and the stasis keeps it fresh. They watched him take out a set of chopsticks and begin tucking into his bowl of soup and then grabbing another one for Nizu, who already had his own cutlery. It's safe to eat, by the way. I am human and was born and raised in Musurifu, Japan until I was 8 years old. Nizu looked to the detective, who nodded his head twice, seemingly the signal for absolute truth. Nizu began enjoying his soup as well, complimenting the flavor. So what other questions you got for me? Tsukachi shook his head and began again. What happened when you arrived on scene? Izuku took a moment to finish his bite and answered, I came through the portal and said goodbye to Khadgar, just in case I can't get the spell working on this end, and turned around to see Aizawa here on the ground held by an unidentified undead that I now know as Nomu, a man made of smoke standing off to the side doing nothing, and a man covered in severed hands standing with a threatening posture reaching out towards 3 young adults, roughly my age I think. He took a sip of tea. Once I identified the aggressors, I offered to mediate the conflict, hoping for a non-violent end to the altercation, and when that didn't work I asked Kurojire for more information and performed a scrying spell on him, noticing that he wasn't in control of his actions and was brainwashed to do whatever the leader said while they were together. The Nomu was under the same restraints. Talks fell through and the leader, Shigaraki Tamura, charged at me. I used a silencing spell on Kurojire to stop him from opening portals, then used the arcane binding spell on Shigaraki. When he realized he was captured, Shigaraki went ballistic and told the Nomu to kill me. The thing moved faster than I could see, but the moment it stopped in front of me to kill me I used a polymorph spell to turn it into a rabbit, then placed it in a cage, and placed the cage into a stasis container. Tsukachi nodded his head twice and let Izuku take another bite of his food before following up, you mentioned several different spells. Is that your quirk? Izuku shook his head, drawing confused looks from everyone other than Aizawa and a slightly suspicious look from All Might. No, detective, I don't have a quirk. Izuku watched as everyone other than Aizawa, who he guessed had heard him explain that to Shigaraki earlier, froze up at the confession. The teachers all looked at Tsukachi, who nodded twice again and then back to Izuku, who decided to clarify, like I told Handy. I was very upset when I was a child after being labeled quirkless and faced a lot of discrimination, bullying, and nearly daily beatings by the kids my age, and the teachers had started blaming everything on me, changing my grades because, and I quote, "Nulls can't be that smart," and looking the other way when the kids used their quirks on me. Izuku took a moment to calm down while everyone else looked at him in sympathy. The only positive I had in my life at the time was my mother, who I have waited years to see again. Tsukachi nodded and asked another question, "If you don't have a quirk, how were you able to do the things you did?" Izuku nodded. It was a good question from their perspective. I spent 4 years training under Grand Master monks who taught me hand-to-hand combat, movement skills, and healing magic. I spent 6.5 years learning primarily from one Archmage and occasionally a few others in the ways of magic other than restorative. I specialize in detainment and logistical magic, though I have learned enough of everything to have been named the youngest Archmage in history. Though that was a very recent thing and I still need more practice with some of the more esoteric fire spells. Nizu nods, placing his bowl on the table and asking what Izuku thought should have been asked when he first entered the room. Young Midoriya dash. Just Izuku, sir. I have spent longer having my given name used than going by my family name, and it feels more natural to me now. Izuku interrupted politely. Nizu nods again. Young Izuku then. Would you mind giving me any details about your mother that you can think of so I can see where she is and if possible get her here? Izuku smiles, then frowns. I have no problem asking for help finding her, it saves me a lot of time to be honest. But why do you want her to come here? Aizawa spoke up here, because you're still a mostly unknown third party with no affiliation that we recognize that appeared during an invasion on university property with abilities we can scarcely understand right now. We'd like to keep you here for observation until we are certain you're not a threat. Izuku frowned again at this. I helped you though. I displayed no offensive techniques and used all non-lethal spells to detain the hostiles I engaged and provided aid to those in need directly after the battle. Aizawa, ignoring the looks he was getting from Nizu and All Might, countered, Kid, the law calls that vigilantism. We're not trying to throw you in jail, we only want to understand the particulars for the safety of the school. Izuku looked confused at this. I know it's been a while, but unless the law has changed, I broke no vigilantism laws. Tsukachi looked confused at this. His quirk said that was an absolute truth, but from his own testimony he clearly broke the vigilante laws. Nizu is grinning. That's not good. Nizu decided to explain. Aizawa. He didn't break the vigilante laws because he can't break the vigilante laws. Legally he is incapable of becoming a vigilante. What? Aizawa and Tsukachi both looked at Nizu like he'd had a slide. Vigilantism is defined as using your quirk to stop a crime in progress without a license to do so. Yes, he doesn't have a license, but he also doesn't have a quirk to use in the first place. Nizu giggled at the loophole. He loved finding loopholes to inane laws. Aizawa looks nonplussed at this. That's clearly semantics. His abilities would be considered a quirk if people knew about them. It just wouldn't show up on a quirk test. Izuku was getting a little annoyed now. From what's being said, he's being held against his will and someone he saved the life of is trying to have him under surveillance. Let's be clear here. I did not break a law. I stepped into a conflict on accident. I tried several times to end the altercation without using any of my abilities or violence of any kind. When I determined that wasn't possible, I used non-lethal take-down methods to secure the area and then used my combat medic training and magic to heal you and your coworker. Instead of just opening a portal and leaving at that point, which would have been my right, I stayed behind to give a statement to the police. To be frank, you have no authority or probable cause to keep me here. If I wanted, I could leave at this second and you'd have no way to stop me. Izuku finished with a glare at Aizawa and a frown now seeming to sit on his face instead of the calming smile they'd become used to seeing. All Might stepped in to calm the situation. Whoa. You're both correct. You are a little suspicious and you're also perfectly within your rights to leave now or any time, as you have given a true statement of the events that occurred. All Might nodded to both men and turned back to Izuku. In this case, we'd like to ask questions about your abilities. I think Nizu might want the questions answered for a few reasons, but the rest of us besides Tsukachi are heroes, and you've admitted to being taken away from your home at the age of 8, and you've also mentioned a few times that you were an active participant on the battlefield. Around here that means you've participated in a war. We are simply worried and want to make sure you are safely returned to your family, as well as making sure our school is safe from anyone or anything involving you being here. Well said, All Might. Nizu said, smiling at the man who is really never given the recognition he deserves for his mind. Here, tell me what you know about your mother and we will have as pleasant a conversation as possible. I am very interested in your story and your abilities. Not merely what you can do with them, but that you were taught them. Are you able to teach others? Izuku calmed down a little and thought through the question. Azeroth has several different classes that are used to categorize combat specialties. He began and Nizu leaned forward in his seat to give Izuku his undivided attention. Among those classes, I am trained in and have mastery of 2 of them. This is not typical. Nizu raised an eyebrow, a sentiment mirrored by the others in the room. I spent the first year at Tian Monastery. I learned there in a year, what normal acolytes take 4 years to learn. Due to my rapid learning rate, I was recommended to train with Lord Taranju, Master of the Shadow Pan. I learned from him for 3 years and completed training that would take others a decade in that time. It was under Lord Taranju's tutelage that I joined my first major conflict. I was 12 at the time and was the youngest combat medic on any battlefield I entered. I am fully certified as a Grand Master Monk, meaning I could teach others in the ways of the Windwalkers, the Brewmasters, and the Mistweavers. I'm also, as of right now, the only person on Azeroth who completed the certification exam for Grand Mastery of the Brewmaster specialty without ever having drank alcohol. Windwalkers are aggressive but graceful hand-to-hand combatants that use chi and energy to perform feats of strength and agility impossible for others. Brewmasters are adept at attracting attention and shaking off damage. They are also great at crowd control. Mistweavers are healers. Exceptionally effective healers, to be honest. I wish I had time to continue learning and practicing that more over the years, but my training in it has served me well so far. Izuku took a sip of slowly cooling tea now before starting back up. During the time of the conflict in Pandaria, which is the continent I was on from 8 to 13 years old, the very end of the conflict is where I met my mentor and father figure, Archmage Khadgar. Don't get me wrong, Taranju was a phenomenal teacher, but a father figure he is not. Anyway, Khadgar took an interest in me and offered to teach me magic. I accepted and spent any time I wasn't actively involved in war zones learning either directly from him or by studying the library in Dalaran. Most archmages, of which there are very few, spend decades learning what I did in about 6 years. He sighs before taking a deep breath to continue, a little upset about the subject. I'm not trying to brag. I study a lot. I'm constantly making notes and trying new formulas in my spare time. The thing is, I am one of the rare few people who choose to train in more than one class. Others just don't have the time. You can be mediocre at all of the classes or amazing at one. That was the generally accepted rule of thumb people followed. I decided to stick to 2 specializations, 2 classes, if you will. They complement each other very well. Just before I came back to Japan, I earned my qualification as an Archmage, so yes, technically I am qualified to teach this class as well. Like I mentioned, I'm still a ways off true mastery for fire magic, but that will come in time. My arcane and frost magic is well past the mark of an Archmage. Izuku calmly finished the last of his noodle soup and put the leftover bowl in his inventory to wash later, taking Nizu's empty bowl as well. Then spoke up, my mother's name is Midoriya Inko. When I left, I think she was still married to Midoriya Hisashi. Inko, at the time, was a stay-at-home mom here in Mizudafu. I could point out the apartment if I were on the right road, but I don't know if she's moved. Midoriya Hisashi at the time was working abroad and was very rarely in Japan. Nizu hopped off his seat and moved to his desk to begin the search, and within minutes was on the phone asking his mother to stop by the university as soon as she could make it. He offered a ride if she didn't have one. While Izuku couldn't hear his mother's voice, he felt much better when he heard Nizu say that a car would be at her home to retrieve her in 15 minutes. All he had to do now was wait a little under an hour. Midoriya Inko was 2 things if nothing else. A loving mother. A ball of sometimes incapacitating anxiety. Sometimes she was both of those at once. Like a little over 10 years ago when her baby boy vanished on his birthday. July 15th had gone from one of the most joyous days of her year to her uncontested worst day of the year. No one could tell her where her baby went. No one could tell her if he was taken or wandered off on his own. No one could tell her if he was still alive. The detective she spoke with for the case had even called in a friend with a bloodhound quirk to track Izuku's scent. Nothing. His scent created a trail from the front door of their apartment to roughly half the distance to the park Izuku went to frequently to work on his schoolwork and occasionally play with his friends, if he had any at that point, that is. From there it just disappeared. It didn't taper off or lead to a side street. It just stopped, like he was teleported away or simply stopped existing. There had been no word anywhere or from anyone as to his location for over a decade now. Inko had been inconsolable for 5 years. Her estranged husband got off his butt in the States and flew back to her side just days after their son's disappearance. He devoted himself to taking care of her again and forced his company to transfer him to a closer office to care for his depressed wife and mourn the loss of their son. He got the transfer and had been splitting his time between his distraught wife and providing for them with the initially lower salary. Thankfully, he was still able to move upwards in the company and his wages had gone back to what he'd made overseas right around the time when Inko had begun to liven up again. It took nearly half a year of intense physical therapy and twice daily workouts, but she was back in near peak shape again. The couple had discussed it for the entire time and decided to have another child. 9 months after Inko had gotten back in shape, Izumi was born, nearly a carbon copy of her brother and just as enamored with heroes as she grew older, and was at the age to start displaying her quirk, if she had one. This had put stress back onto Inko again. She was so worried Izumi would have to go through the same things Izuku had gone through, and resolved herself to support her daughter no matter what so that she could make up for the failures she made before. Thankfully Izumi had begun showing signs of some kind of fire manipulation quirk, and after a trip to a different quirk doctor they found out Izumi had the ability to absorb thermal energy around her and either manipulate flames or enhance her body with the energy she took in. Quite a powerful quirk, and one that would serve her well in her dream of heroism. What hadn't made sense was when she got a call from UA's Dean Nizu. He had asked her to come to the university to discuss something with her regarding her child, and while she couldn't understand why someone so important would be interested in Izumi, even with her quirk, she wasn't going to decline the invitation from quite possibly the smartest being on Earth. She agreed to be picked up and called Hisashi to let him know she was going out for a meeting and that she would be back later. Izumi would be with her so he didn't need to worry, and if she wasn't there when he got off work to just order food and she'd be home when the meeting was over. He agreed as long as she texted him often to know she was okay. She dressed herself in some better clothes and got Izumi up from her nap and dressed her before the car arrived, and they made their way to the most prestigious hero university in Japan, still unable to fathom why Nizu wanted to meet up about a 4-year-old. The driver knew nothing about it either, opting to chat about recent news in order to, in his own words, not think about what the rat wanted any longer than necessary. She found the comment equal parts insulting to his employer and amusing that he called his boss a rat. Sure, Izuku had told her that Nizu was likely a chimera and not a single species at all, but she could see how some people would call the dean a rat out of either spite or familiarity. The driver guided them to the dean's office and left before she could knock on the door, likely to escape dealing with his boss, she mused. When she reached forwards to knock, the door opened slowly instead, and she was treated to the sight of a tastefully decorated room with a large and definitely expensive desk in front of several full floor-to-ceiling windows, several comfortable-looking chairs around it, and a large couch with a coffee table placed in front of it on one wall with large shelves filled with books on the opposing wall. She took note of the dean, who had smiled at her arrival and motioned her to come in, and once she had entered the room she was directed to the couch where she saw a young man who looked familiar to her with his hood up, probably some pro-hero, and several teachers and the detective she had spoken with a few times over the years. Her thought processes ground to an absolute halt after she sat down on the very comfortable couch and got her daughter situated in her lap when the young man turned to her and met her gaze with his shining emerald orbs that sparked her memories and looked oh so very much like the photos she kept around the house of her missing son and looked identical to her daughter's eyes. No. Absolutely not. It couldn't be. Her mind shut down and her vision went black as she passed out to the sound of the young man calling out to her and reaching to stabilize her. Mom. She felt herself waking up and heard some muffled voices off to her side. She tuned them out for the moment while she tried to remember where she was and how she ended up asleep. She was sure she had gotten a call from a school about her child and had been brought over to speak with the principal. No, wait, the dean. Which school? UA. Right, UA's dean called to talk to her about her child. She remembered arriving and sitting on the couch with a young man and his very familiar, very striking eyes. She knew those eyes. They were the same ones in the photos in her house and the same eyes she saw whenever she looked at her daughter's face. The dean didn't call her about Izumi. He called her about her other child. Her baby boy. Her eyes shot open and her upper body jolted upright, with her head whipping side to side trying to find the young man again to make sure she hadn't dreamed up the encounter. Her eyes went to the scene directly in front of her on the floor where the man was holding and playing with Izumi, who was giggling and asking him questions about something. Knowing her daughter, it was probably about his quirk. She was so much like Izuku had been. So fixated on quirks and heroes. Inko hoped that her questioning wouldn't upset her quirkless son, but was frozen again when she heard his voice and held out a hand to the little girl, and a ball of fire ignited into existence in his palm. Oh, that's not her son. She very quickly became upset with herself for getting her hopes up again, knowing how badly this was going to affect her for the next few weeks. She tuned into the conversation between the two just in time to hear her daughter ask a question. That's so cool. Is that your quirk? The 4-year-old asked, her eyes shining with curiosity and glee. The man chuckled, once again triggering memories of Izuku's laughter from so long ago. Afraid not, squirt. What? I don't have a quirk. What? The little girl looked at him in confusion and tilted her head to the side before asking the obvious question, if you don't have a quirk, how'd you make the fire? Is it a support item? Inko could feel hope growing, sparking back to life again in her chest as she waited for the answers she knew would come if this was her son. "That's strike two, little lady," the man said with another chuckle as he tickled Izumi briefly. If Inko cared at all about the other occupants of the room, she'd have noticed how everyone else was smiling at the interaction. Once she was done laughing, she pouted and crossed her arms. "If it's not a quirk and not a support item, then how'd you make the fire?" The man sat the little girl on the floor in front of him and raised his hands to shoulder height and made the jazz hands motion while using a childish voice to respond with magic. "Magic? You can do magic?" Izumi was now transfixed on the man who had been playing with her since she and her mother arrived. She still didn't know his name though, so she decided to ask before seeing if he could teach her. "What's your name and can you teach me magic too?" "Oh, did I not introduce myself?" Izumi shook her head vigorously. "How rude of me," the man said as he stood up to his full height and took his hood off, revealing long black hair with green highlights tied into a tight ponytail. Inko felt her heart stop beating. The hair, the voice, the mannerism, the laugh. The man bowed to the girl and laid a kiss on her tiny hand, much to the girl's amusement. "Well, young lady, I am Izuku. Midoriya Izuku." The girl looked at him again in confusion. "Midoriya? But that's my name. Our first names are so similar too." The man chuckled again and reached forward to pick up the girl and brought her to his chest while he stood again and turned to his side. Inko could now see the smile, the freckles under his eye in the familiar pattern, the eye again that she thought she'd only ever see in her daughter again. "Well, I should hope we have the same last name. We would only be half-siblings if we had different family names after all," he said, his eyes squinting closed and his smile extending across his face. It was too much. Inko wept. The noise drew everyone in the room's eyes to her, but she only had eyes for the young man standing before her, holding her daughter, his sister, and giving her an understanding and worried smile. He stepped closer to her and knelt down while still holding Izumi. She watched as his face, older than she remembered obviously and with a few very small faded scars that only seemed to add to his appeal. He looked so much like her and Hisashi. There was no denying it. This was her boy. "Hey Mom, I missed you," Izuku said as he reached out with his free hand and held his mother's face gently, using his thumb to clear her tears on one side. "Izuku," she shouted and rushed to bring both of her children into as close a hug as she could, not daring to let go, lest he vanish again. The three stayed there for several minutes as Inko cried into her son's embrace and her kids worked to calm her down, everyone else giving them time and privacy. When Inko finally finished crying and felt safe enough to lean back but still holding Izuku's shoulders, she leveled a glare at the man. "Where have you been, young man? Do you even understand how worried I was about you? It's been almost 11 years. I don't even remember the first 5 years, they were so bad. If your father hadn't come back to Japan to take care of me, I wouldn't be here right now. You better have the best explanation on the planet or I am grounding you until you are my age and never letting you leave my sight." She saw Izuku's face fall with sadness and guilt as he nodded to her and moved out of her grasp to stand again, though he did place Izumi back in her lap beforehand, and walked over to one of the chairs to the side and let out a long sigh as he stared at the ceiling for a long time. Eventually, and just before Inko was going to prompt him again, Izuku spoke up and asked the dean if he wanted anyone else here before he started. "No need, young Izuku. I will be filming the proceedings in case I need to discuss it with anyone else later. Please begin when you're ready," the Chimera said with a supportive paw wave. "Right. Izuku's POV. I guess I should start from the beginning then. This story starts on my 8th birthday. I was caught in a dimensional distortion on my way to the park, I think? I was going there to relax and maybe see if there was anyone else my age to play with. The air cracked open in front of me and I was sucked into a dark swirling portal filled with shades of purple and green. I later found out that the portal I fell into was a malfunctioning dark portal that a possessed Archmage was opening to an entirely different world to facilitate an invasion on the world I landed on. The malfunction kept me frozen in time until I was spit out into a small village called Honeydew Village on a continent called Pandaria on a world called Azeroth. I was kept in stasis for a long time. 25 years, I think," Izuku said and paused to think. He nodded to himself and ignored the wide eyes he was getting from everyone else. Inko noticed that everyone else was glancing at the detective, who nodded twice before they all looked back at Izuku again. "Anyway, roughly 10.5 years ago I landed in that little village, and after some discussion with the Pandaren, the primary race living there were these anthropomorphic panda people, they decided that I could stay and helped me with a home, supplies, and even let me train as a monk. They also helped me with my depression and anxiety, something I can never thank them enough for. When I arrived I was a wreck, not only because I was, presumably, never going to get back home, but also because of the bullying and tormenting that I had been receiving for the last 4 years before I got transported there. He grimaced and Inko could feel her eyes watering again. She knew he was going through some troubles but not how bad they were. About a year later and I had completed the normal 4 years of monk training. They put their initiates through as well as become a fairly good cook and picked up farming and tailoring for my rest days from the physical training. At a certain point a representative of the Shadow Pan arrived to test the initiates to see who was eligible to join their ranks. Sorry, the Shadow Pan were like the elite monks who were tasked with defending Pandaria from anyone or anything who would cause harm to it or its people. Izuku clarified when they all seemed confused. I was initially looked over by the representative because of my age and race. They generally didn't accept any initiates below the age of 10 and had never trained a non-Pandaren before. But when they watched the sparring and saw how far I'd progressed as well as getting my story from the monks at the Tian Monastery, which is where I had been training, they decided to give me the option to join them. I accepted, thanked the villagers and made my way to meet Lord Taranju, master of the Shadow Pan. He tested me thoroughly. He really didn't like me when we met. Man was a bit of a xenophobe to be honest. Izuku said, clearly remembering some unpleasant times while the adults gave him looks of pity and his sister looked confused at the word. He noticed this and smiled. A xenophobe is someone who is frightened of other races. In my case he seemed to hate me, the human, trying to break their traditions and train with the elite Pandaren youth. Izumi nodded her head now in understanding though looked a little angry in defense of her new brother. Izuku smiled at her support before getting back into the story. After I managed to prove my resolve he took me on as a student and pushed me well past my limits every day. Physical training, monk training, general education, trapping, stealth, information gathering, anatomy, everything I'd need to perform my duties as a member of the Shadow Pan, and if I ever left the organization I'd know enough to support myself. It was a grueling 3 years. Eventually I ended up passing all of the trials though, much earlier than planned. I earned my first qualification as a Windwalker, then as a Mistweaver, and finally, after spending almost a year and a half trying to figure out how to use some of the abilities without using alcohol, I got my Brewmaster certification. I spent another 4 months under Taranju's personal tutelage before we discovered a problem on Pandaria. The Sha had started popping up. The Sha were physical manifestations of negative emotions. We eventually found out they were being generated by an imprisoned old god and we left the temple to figure out a way to get rid of them. During our investigation we stumbled upon ruined airships. Pandaria had been surrounded by a magical barrier of mist for hundreds of years preventing anyone else from arriving up until this point, so we approached with caution assuming it was an invading force. It was at this point when he felt his throat going dry, so he grabbed a glass flask from his pouch and conjured some water to sip from. He gratefully accepted the offered tea from the dean as he continued, it wasn't an invasion though. The Horde and the Alliance had crash-landed on our land by accident and their presence, while it was creating more Sha because of their negative emotions, they were at war with each other, also allowed us more manpower against the Sha once Taranju finally trusted them enough to accept the help they offered. With a united front against the Sha, as well as a resurrected enemy of the Pandaren called the Mogu, we eventually managed to take down the threats and move to suppress a coup by a disgraced leader of the Horde named Garrosh Hellscream. I was the youngest combat medic on the battlefield at this point. I got a lot of experience with emergency triage during the months of conflict here. But probably the best thing that happened here was meeting the man who became my mentor and a new father figure. Archmage Khadgar ran into me during one of the battles against the Sha and we grew close as the war went on. At the end, when we arrested Garrosh, Khadgar offered to train me as a mage. Taranju allowed me to do so and I went with Khadgar back to his home in Dalaran, the flying city of mages. The story was interrupted by Izumi's stomach growling and Izuku gave her an amused chuckle. He turned to his mother and asked, "Does Izumi like katsudon, udon, or ramen?" Izumi didn't let her mother answer for her though. "You have katsudon? That's my favorite," she shouted with her eyes sparkling. Izuku was taken aback momentarily before laughing loudly for a minute straight. "Hiya, we really are brother and sister," he cackled a bit more as he reached into his pouch and brought out a steaming bowl of katsudon for the little girl and a pair of chopsticks with a wooden spoon just in case. Izumi was moved to Inko's side while she ate at the coffee table after Izuku laid out a piece of thick leather from an animal no one else could identify as a placemat. "Anyone else want some food?" When he got negatives from everyone he restarted his story again. Khadgar was a great teacher. He gave me a list of books to read that he says I should be able to get through in about 5 years. About that time he was called to help track down Garrosh, who had somehow managed to connect the dark portal to an alternated past version of the planet it was originally connected to, the home world of the orcs, Dreener. After promising to get back to me soon, Khadgar left me to the Mage Tower in Dalaran, where I spent 3 months reading through his curriculum with occasional lessons from the other Archmages stationed in Dalaran once I had shown myself adept at detainment and logistical magic. I happened to overhear one of the Archmages receiving a report from a mage that had come back from Draenor detailing the situation there and decided to offer my assistance where I could. They weren't going to allow me to go until I reminded them that I had combat medic experience, was adept at CQC, and had the ability to teleport myself and allies away from danger. They eventually caved and I was sent back with the messenger to Draenor. I threw myself into my work there, rejoining my master on the front lines, though pulled back in a supportive role in logistics and tactical command, as I had training in battlefield command for several years now and was pretty good at analysis. In a few months we had confronted Garrosh again and he was killed in honorable combat by the previous warchief of the Horde, Thrall. We managed to rout the Iron Horde and send Gul'dan, the orc who had caused the original orcs to invade Azeroth, by tricking them into drinking demon blood for power, but enslaving them until the demon was slain, back to his masters in the Burning Legion. He took a moment to enjoy his tea and ease his voice a bit while everyone else requested food or tea for themselves, or simply stretched. They had been here for a while now after all. Izuku sighed and his eyes took on a troubled quality as he stared into the distance. Now we get to the absolute sheetstorm that was the invasion of the Burning Legion. Izuku! Inko shouted while Izumi laughed. Language, young man. Mom. I'm an 18-year-old decorated war veteran. Izuku whined, much to the amused appreciation of those around him. Inko eyed him seriously and pointed to his sister, who finally finished laughing and said, "It's okay, Mom. Kachin says way worse." Izuku's eyes focused on the little girl and then whipped his head up to meet his mother's eyes. "You let her associate with Katsuki?" Inko, confused, looked back at his eyes, trying to figure out why he looked so upset. "He was your best friend, why would I keep him away from Izumi?" Izuku sighed deeply and the teachers could feel the atmosphere change. Aizawa zeroed in on the topic, seeing as it involved his student. "Mom, I know this is partially my fault for not mentioning it to you all those years ago, but Katsuki, when I left, was a horrible bully. I still have scars from his quirk being used on me. He treated me lower than the worms inside of the dirt and used me for quirk practice nearly every day. I think he saw me as his own personal punching bag, especially when I stepped between him and whoever else he might have been targeting." The adults froze at the admission. Upon getting a confirmation from the detective, Nizu added a name to his list and Aizawa made a mental note to check on the boy and see if he needs counseling or if he'd gotten out of that phase. He refused to teach a bully. Izumi was distraught. But Kachin wouldn't do that. He plays with me all the time. Izuku, while surprised, smiles at her. "I can only hope that he's changed then since I left. As long as he hasn't been hurting you or calling you mean names, I'll look the other way." Izumi. Deciding to get off that topic, Izuku went back to his story. So, the invasion. After his defeat, Gul'dan brought intel back to his masters in the Burning Legion. The leader of the Legion, Sargeras, ordered him to open the sealed portal in the tomb of Sargeras, a misnomer as he's never actually died. The tomb was built on the spot where his avatar was slain long ago. At the time, I accompanied Khadgar back to Karazhan to search for answers on how to reseal the portal in its ancient library. We spent a good 6 months researching portal magic and eventually found what we were searching for. We rejoined the war effort and helped push the Legion back to the tomb after thwarting an attempt by a group of Legion sabotants to turn Karazhan into another portal to invade from. Shortly thereafter we fought Kil'jaeden, one of Sargeras' most powerful subordinates, and killed him while sealing the portal Gul'dan opened before his death. He took a breath and had some tea again. After Kil'jaeden's death, an ally of ours named Illidan opened a rift through space between Azeroth and Argus, the home world of the Legion. Months of bloody war and countless deaths later, we managed to push through into Antorus, the Burning Throne, the seat of the Burning Legion's power, and freed the spirits of the imprisoned Titan Pantheon. We stuck together and took down all of Sargeras' forces all the way to the top, but I was forced to retreat before we reached Argus, the Titan world soul that Sargeras had twisted and tormented to do his bidding. Our united forces claimed victory and put the poor Titan out of his misery, and Illidan stayed with the other Titans in order to imprison Sargeras for all eternity. Sargeras, in a last act of defiance, stabbed Azeroth with a giant sword, trying to kill the slumbering world soul. Izuku paused his retelling here and grinned. "You know, the best part of the Legion invasion and all that it entailed was my further mastery over portal magic. I had been harried by squadrons of assassins for nearly a year and finally managed to come up with a series of spells that would allow myself and Khadgar to always have a safe house to escape to that was inaccessible to others. I took special pleasure in flipping off the last squad that tried to assassinate me when we killed Kil'jaeden." "Why are you so nonchalant about having multiple assassination attempts made on your life?" Aizawa jumped in, to try to make sense of the sheer absurdity of this story that, so far, Tsukachi hadn't stopped for a false statement being made. Oh, that. Izuku said with a grin. Turns out that combat medics and tactical command forces are prime targets for enemy assassins. Doubly so when the two positions are taken by the same person. I got very good at evading and retaliating, escaped a majority of attempts, killed most of the rest in self-defense, sent some to jail, convinced several more to swap sides. The Pandaren and another group I'm getting to soon helped me with the trauma response, so I'm mostly okay now. Hound Dog, who had so far just been taking notes, growled at this, not believing the boy but had to take it at face value when the detective didn't question it. Anyway, after the Legion Khadgar and I divested ourselves of the conflict that had erupted between the Horde and the Alliance now that the common enemy was gone again. Neither of us wanted to pick sides and it got a few more assassins sent after us. We retreated to Karazhan and occasionally showed up in Dalaran, and during that time I studied under Khadgar directly and sometimes another Archmage named Kalegos. 2 years went by like this. Most of my time was spent studying magic and learning new crafts or exploring the continents with my portals. It was around this time when I was called back to Karazhan by Khadgar as we had visitors. Representatives of the Horde and Alliance had come by to beg for our assistance against Sylvanas, once a leader of the Horde but betrayed everyone to join the new opposition, and the jailer. Izuku tensed his entire body at the mention of this new enemy, and it wasn't nearly subtle enough to escape anyone's notice. Not even Izumi's. We spent 2 more years in the land of the dead fighting that manipulative BSTRD and all of his forces. As it turns out, he was the puppet master in the shadows for a lot of the horrible shit that went down over the years on Azeroth. I don't want to go into details about this war. I was getting help dealing with what we went through from the Pandaren and the Kyrians, especially Carestia the Archon, who I had become good friends with, but I only stuck around for 3 months after the death of the jailer and after we finished getting the land of the afterlife set back up to run smoothly again. Yes, that term was literal. We were fighting in a place called the Shadowlands, which is where all souls go once they die to follow one of 4 paths to eternity. Izuku wasn't able to stop the laughter he saw on everyone's faces at that revelation. 2 months after the jailer died, I found Khadgar in the Ardenweald, one of the realms of death, and he told me he had finally found the spell that would be able to send me home. I spent a month saying my goodbyes and collecting materials just in case it was a one-way trip, and finally stepped through the portal and landed in the USJ where I found you all. Now I'm here. Izuku finished, almost as a side thought. The detective stood up, bowed to Izuku and his family and began to turn around, leaving them with, "I thank you for your time, but that entire story was textbook, not my job for me. I'm glad you're back with your mother and soon your whole family, but I need to get back to the station to help with the captured villains that were brought in today." He received a handshake from Izuku before he left and assurance that Izuku didn't blame him for the wait. "Well," came the voice of the dean, who had been silent since the beginning of the story, "that was certainly an adventure you've been on, young Izuku. I have no doubt that you'll want to head home and get some rest for a while, but would it be alright if I called to ask for more information about Azeroth or your journey some other time? They sound fascinating." Izuku smiled at the dean while helping his mother stand and holding Izumi. "I don't mind at all, sir. Anytime I'm free I'll be happy to stop by for a conversation." It was as Izuku and his family were walking through the door that All Might stood up and coughed to grab their attention. "Young Izuku, would you mind my asking you something quickly? It shouldn't take long." He could tell the man meant without his family present, so he ushered them out the door and told them he'd meet them at the entrance as he stepped back into the room and closed the door. "How can I help?" All Might smiled at the question as steam began to billow from his skin. The rest of the room's occupants started to shout at him about not showing that to a random civilian, but he clearly didn't listen as suddenly the mountain of muscles was gone and in its place was an emaciated old man with blood dripping down from his mouth. The bleeding seemed like an old issue as he had already brought a handkerchief up to wipe it away. "You see, young Izuku, I was injured quite badly about 6 years ago now and lost a lung, most of my stomach, and left lots of random miscellaneous damage to the area that has scarred over till now," he says as he lifts his shirt to show one of the worst scars Izuku had seen so far. "I'm hoping you might have a method to help out with this. I'm not sure what all magic can heal, but I felt it wouldn't hurt to ask, and as you have a military background I know you can keep secrets." Izuku thought for a moment before walking back over to the man and carefully removing his shirt to get a better look. It was far too badly damaged for himself to do the majority of the healing, but he could assist someone else. "It's beyond my capabilities." All Might seem to just accept that at face value, clearly not expecting much. "But I have a friend who might be able to help, I'll have to ask." It wasn't just All Might who perked up at this, everyone was now looking hopeful. "I need some space, so clear out away from this corner over here and let me try this portal spell to see what we're working with." Everyone moved away from the corner he indicated and he got to work. It took nearly 10 minutes of failures before a blue portal burst into existence and Izuku could see the town he was hoping for through this side, so he held up a hand to the teachers who were closing in on the portal out of curiosity and to defend against whatever might come out. It's okay, the portal worked, give me a few more minutes to see if she's available and I'll be right back through. He promptly ignored any response they may have had and walked through the portal. The teachers stood in the room, still in a defensive semicircle around the portal when Izuku walked back out, followed by a woman who seemed to glow with a pale yellow light and didn't seem quite alive. Faculty, meet Kalia Menethil. Kalia, meet the staff at the academy I mentioned. We're here to see if you have a method to heal this man. He gestured to All Might, who was still shirtless. He took a bad injury about 6 years ago and it cost him a couple organs and messed up everything else in the area of the scar. Can you take a look and see what can be done? The woman nodded to Izuku but didn't address the rest of the faculty as she walked towards the patient and laid a hand over the scar tissue and closed her eyes. She remained that way for nearly a minute before opening her eyes again and speaking in an ethereal voice to Izuku. This is a little too much for me, but maybe if you asked Alexstrasza the three of us could work together on it. I'd also ask a druid for help, but I'm not sure who you have contact with and most druids avoid me because of the whole walking corpse thing, she finished, hope springing forth in All Might eyes until the last bit, and now everyone understood why she didn't quite look alive. She wasn't. At least not in the traditional sense. Izuku thanked Kalia for her help and sent her back home while forming a new portal to Wyrmrest Accord. Last time I said I'd go fetch the person. Where Kalia lives is mostly safe for humans, so you could have followed, but I'd rather not lose you in the city. This time I need you all to wait here. Wyrmrest Accord is not safe for those who aren't dragonkin or who haven't proven themselves allies of the dragons, he told the group, who nodded in understanding as he walked back through. Several minutes later he appeared back in the room but without a follower and closed the portal with a wave. Unfortunately Alexstrasza isn't in right now, she was called away to investigate something and should be returning next week, so I'll try again at that time. All Might merely stood up and bowed to the young man. Thank you for at least trying to check for me. I look forward to seeing what might be able to be done, but don't feel too bad if it's impossible. I only asked on a whim as I figured magic might be able to help. Izuku smiled at this and shook the man's hand. In all likelihood Alexstrasza is going to be able to do it by herself. She's incredibly powerful, less so now but still in the upper echelons of power on Azeroth. I am acquainted with her due to her visiting Pandaria once during the last year I was there, so she could see the dragons there. She should be happy enough to help but may ask for something in return. She is a dragon of life. Scratch that, the dragon of life. She held the title of Aspect until a few years ago when she had to give up her immortality and excess power to stop a rogue Aspect from destroying Azeroth. While she isn't quite as capable as she used to be, regrowing a few organs for a human shouldn't tax her too much. He bowed again and ignored the 1,000-yard stares he got from the faculty as he made his way out of the university towards his mother and sister at the gate. There was a man standing next to them who was introduced as the driver who brought his mother here earlier and was asked to drive them home as well. Finally, Izuku could take a break without worrying about a world-ending threat. Izuku found himself waiting anxiously behind the door to an apartment he didn't recognize, holding a sister he just met, and watching a mother he yearned to see again for over a decade fussing around with her keys, obviously trying to get past something like a panic attack that he remembered she was prone to when he was younger. He turned to his little sister, the girl looking so much like himself that it honestly threw him for a loop after being in a place where he was always just slightly different from everyone else, and grinned at her. "Mom is still as anxious as I remember, huh?" he said playfully under his breath, his sister giggling quietly in response. "Mommy gets like this all the time. Kachin," says she. Oh, right." She paused and put on what she probably thought was a menacing glare. Auntie Inko is nerfed with anxiety because it's the only thing holding her back from taking over the world. Izumi finished as her menacing glare, really just an adorable pout, went back to her normal adorable smile. Inko, naturally, heard her children laughing at her expense and sighed with a fond smile, finally seeming to get over her nerves and put her key in the door. She hesitated for another moment before she opened the door and Izuku heard her call out that she was back and another voice that he didn't recognize return with "Welcome home." He knew, logically, that voice was most likely Hisashi, his father, but he hadn't heard the man speak since he was 6, so he honestly couldn't remember his voice. He put his finger to his lips as he looked at his sister and she nodded with a wide grin on her face. He decided to have some fun. "We're home," his Inko began but was cut off by her son using what she could only describe as a high-class accent. My, ladies Midoriya, you have a lovely home. Thank you again for the invitation to dinner," Izuku said with the brightest, most sheet-eating grin he had ever worn adorning his face. Hisashi clearly wasn't expecting the unfamiliar voice as they heard him walking over from wherever he'd been in the home. "Oh, Inko, I didn't know we were going to have guests. I think I made enough food, but if not I don't mind making a little more for them." "Do I know you, sir?" Hisashi had gone from worried to confused within the same breath, which at this point Izuku figured was just something he must have inherited from both parents. "Ah, yes, where are my manners? Allow me to introduce myself," Izuku said, the same smirk plastered as he gave a dramatic, though well-practiced, bow while still holding Izumi, who seemed to enjoy herself if the stifled laughter she was trying to hide behind her hands were any indication. "I am the Grand Tactician of the Unified Forces of the Horde and the Alliance, decorated combat medic of 4 separate major wars, youngest Grand Master Monk, and youngest Archmage of Dalaran. Also pretty good at crafting. Midoriya Izuku, at your service." He finished with a flourish as he lifted himself out of his bow to lock eyes with the man he hadn't seen in a little over 12 years and hadn't lived with in 14. He was willing to see how this went, not having given the man much thought since he'd been gone, as he had always assumed he had abandoned he and his mother after his quirkless diagnosis, but had been told by his mother that that wasn't the case on the way home. What he wasn't expecting was for the man to faint, much like his mother did earlier. He stared at the downed man and then looked back at his sister. "Does he do that often, Izumi?" She could only barely shake her head as she watched her mother fret over her father, unwilling to talk until she knew he was fine. Muffled grunting coming from the man laying on his face on the, luckily carpeted, floor shook them out of their silence as their father turned his bleary eyes to their mother. "Sorry, Inko, don't know what came over me, but I had the weirdest dream. Some young man walked into our home and said he was our son. And a war vet? I gotta stop working so much overtime." Inko shook her head and smiled. "Well, you could stand to work less overtime, sure. But that wasn't a dream," she said as she gently raised her husband's upper body to face his son, holding his daughter, both of whom wore matching million-watt smiles. Izuku spoke up first. "Hello Hisashi, long time no see." Izuku was only slightly happy at the involuntary wince his father made at hearing his name instead of any more familiar term from his son. Figuring he got enough payback with that out of the way, he continued, "Have I got some stories for you guys," and took his and Izumi's footwear off before stalking into the home to find the nearest table to sit at. This was going to be a long discussion, but at least he was going to get some homemade food from his parents again. Meanwhile, in the halls of Just Nizu's office. Nizu, much as he has tried over the years, still isn't quite able to understand human emotions and what variables go into them at all times. Case in point, the young man who just left his office. Nizu sees him as a much less traumatized than he should be, all things considered, war hero who seems capable of many fantastical things beyond the scope of quirks which he can apparently teach others to HRNSS as well. The redacted sees this as a complete positive. Sure, he may need to have the man looked into by recovery girl and one of the school-approved therapists, but that is something he does for every student in the hero course during the start of their second year to help them cope with the events of their first year and the 3 coming years in a healthy manner. The other people in the room, however, are not so confident. Sure, a few of his staff see Midoriya in a positive light, mostly those who are emotionally tied to Aizawa or Ainen. Some of them are fairly neutral in their judgment so far, not having seen or heard enough from the man to know one way or another. The rest, though. They're not quite hostile towards Midoriya, but they definitely don't trust him, having waved off the testimony gathered by Detective Tsukachi as if the guy could do everything he showed in the USJ, then he could probably come up with a way to trick a lie detector quirk. The only people who actually believed his claims were the ones present in the room when he made them. "You can't really expect us to believe this, Nizu-san," sighed a man in a beige trench coat, his head a dark bluish-purple, bordering on black, with exposed teeth. He shook his head and looked to his colleagues for support and was only a little exasperated by how little he received. Aizawa, having, in his own words, recovered enough to sit through one more meeting before going to sleep, chimed in. "The kid popped into existence, neutralized the 3 biggest problems, then healed myself and 13 after ensuring the fighting was over. As far as I'm concerned, after having watched that recording, we owe the kid a lot for stepping in when he clearly had the means to leave once he realized what was going on when he arrived. He showed none of the tells I'm familiar with for people who are lying or making up a story when he explained his past and his abilities, and he got Tsukachi's seal of approval, so I'm inclined to believe him." Ectoplasm. Nizu tuned the rest of the conversation out of his higher thinking sections of his brain. His quirk allowed him access to and delegated their conversation to a background process while he worked, instead, on coming up with a plan to invite the young man to the school. He wouldn't be able to join as a student, the entrance exams had just passed and they know nothing about his general education other than he's fairly intelligent in his own right if his learning speed was to be believed. No, he'd likely need a few months to a year to catch up academically to the first-year students in the university, putting him on a clock too far off for Nizu's liking. So if not a student, a teacher? The idea was intriguing. It aligned more with what Nizu wanted to ask of young Izuku than if he were to join as a student if he were being honest. The problem was that he didn't have the qualifications to teach any subject. In Japan, Nizu suddenly remembers a juicy bit of blackmail he can bring up to force the Ministry of Education to grant Izuku a teaching license based on his qualifications from Azeroth. Yes, Chairman Nanagi would be a good target here. The woman had enough pull to quietly approve the teaching license without drawing attention to herself or Izuku, until the media got wind of him, that is, and she also shouldn't have gotten caught on camera performing those acts with various SEC workers and drag paraphernalia. He might be able to force the HPSC to give him a hero license in the same way, though Nizu didn't really relish the idea of parting with any form of blackmail to use against them. This definitely counted as a worthy goal. The man would have to pass their exams, of course, but it was possible. It certainly helped that no one at the HPSC would be able to trap Izuku or force him into servitude. Nizu smiled now, having gotten his timeline of events planned out, and the rest of the room's occupants suddenly went quiet. Oh dear, he had actually stopped paying attention towards the end there, hadn't he? Oh well, their conversation wasn't important. Time to inform his minions of what they could expect to happen soon. Ladies and gentlemen of the faculty, I have a point to bring up for the near future. I intend to hire Midoriya Izuku as a teacher in the coming months and might also try to swing an early attempt at a hero license as well if he passes my tests and his skills translate over to heroics. The room was quiet for nearly 30 whole seconds at this. Nizu was actually surprised. He had expected the outcries to start 15 seconds prior. I'm sure some of you have reservations about this decision, he cut in, silencing the room again, but from my point of view I see a resource capable of teaching several forms of combat, tactics, logistical procedures, survival skills, and magic up to and including healing magic. This is too good an opportunity to pass up. I'd like to speak with our business professors and our psychoanalysts to work on a deal he would appreciate so that we don't lose him to either another school or, heaven forbid, the government. Nizu finished as he clapped his paws. Most of the room took that for the dismissal it was and left him with the staff he requested and a few interested parties. Thank you, esteemed professors. It likely hasn't escaped your notice that I find certain aspects of human psychology incomprehensible at this time, which is why I requested your help. Let's work together to lock down this treasure trove, he exclaimed in glee as his employees sighed and began tossing out ideas. The meeting lasted another hour, but they managed what they saw as something that might appeal to someone in Izuku's position. All that was left was to have him show up again, which Nizu said would be in a week due to a prior commitment. Now, Nizu thought, time to come up with a bare-bones curriculum for Izuku to teach. It's a little difficult without knowing what all he's capable of, but he can simply break down teaching slots throughout the week for different subjects and see if he thought he could fill up the hour and a half with what he could do. They'll run some tests if he agrees to teach and see what he can bring to the table before getting too into it though. Nizu brought up his digital calendar and marked the day next week as well as blanked out the whole day with his secretary and rescheduled a few appointments to be sure he had the time he needed, then sat back and worked on his remaining paperwork for the break-in and the invasion, his meeting flung to the back of his mind though still being planned. 3 days later was when the staff at UA and a certain detective realized that, perhaps, they should have expressed more concern for the quirk usage laws to the returning war hero. There was debris littering the market street of downtown Muscular. Fires had started to spread from ruined storefront to ruined storefront. Power lines, lying limp on the ground leading from dislodged power poles lodged into the pavement or the nearby buildings, were giving out their last sparks of remnant electricity. There was, thankfully, very little blood in the area due to the quick response of several rescue heroes who just happened to have been in the area. Very little, however, didn't mean none. A murderous psychopath had entered the market street nearly 45 minutes ago and had, according to himself, gotten annoyed with how many people were there and decided to get rid of as many as possible. He also said that after the 10th kill he noticed the heroes coming and got even more worked up hoping for a good fight. He killed 18 civilians and 3 rescue heroes before the first combat hero got onto the scene. Unfortunately, the first combat hero proved to be no match for the, now identified, S-rank villain Muscular. The Hero Association had been thinking of elevating his status to supervillain for months, since his last rampage, and had only foregone the upgrade because he was behind bars in one of the most secure prisons in the country. There would need to be an investigation into how he managed to escape, but that was a problem for later. The workers were frantically trying to find out who they could send as backup to the scene, as their first choice, Eraserhead, was currently over an hour away on UA business. They had already lost 4 more combat heroes to at the very least debilitating injury, and it had only been 20 minutes since the actual fight started. One of the operators shouted to her superior to get attention in the den of chaos that was the emergency dispatch and control room. Supervisor! Supervisor! The young lady screamed, causing the yelling to quiet around her momentarily. S-rank combat heroine Mirko has arrived on scene. SIR. The supervisor let out a breath he had probably been holding far too long and called for a camera feed on the scene, as their last one had been targeted by Muscular when one of the other heroes slipped up while the group responding to the emergency was trying to stall Muscular long enough for a more capable fighter to arrive. They had already used up all of the gas grenades Midnight had divvied out, and the madman wasn't letting any of her somnambulist gas get near him. Now though, they had someone who should be able to handle the threat head-on while the rest of the heroes work on containing the damage and removing victims from the area. Luckily there was a drone nearby that managed to re-establish visuals within 2 minutes with backups on the way from the nearest agency. The screen now showed a more devastated marketplace with Backdraft in the background fighting fires using a broken fire hydrant that everyone assumed Muscular had ripped from the ground at some point to use as a projectile. They saw the villain laughing in the street, taunting the rabbit hero who was standing between him and the rescue heroes still working to get civilians out of a partially collapsed building. She was clearly a little worse for the wear and had a nasty bruise forming on her left arm that seemed to be either dislocated or broken. She had likely taken the hit instead of another hero or a civilian, considering she knew enough not to take hits like that, especially from a villain of Muscular's physicality. The occupants of the room watched as she re-engaged Muscular and landed several kicks from angles the man wasn't able to keep up with before having to get in the way of another chunk of pavement he decided to throw at Backdraft, who was getting out of the combat area to handle the fires further into the damaged area. She successfully managed to stop the projectile but seemed to have twisted her ankle in the process and was effectively out of the fight. Worse still was that Muscular seemed to have found out and was evidently not going to let her off to find a new target. He created more muscle mass and seemed to be trying to overwhelm the now mobility-challenged heroine as a method of toying with his foe. Most of the room was now back to trying to locate another suitable hero to call in when one of them noted a man walk into the range of the drone still on the scene. The supervisor watched this man wearing a tunic, some sort of thickly armored pants, and a dark cloak with an odd symbol on the back with his hood up walk to within 20 meters of the skirmish, and a sound-capable drone arrived just in time to broadcast the man who seemed to be giving Muscular an ultimatum. Izuku POV. Izuku had gone out to take a walk to refamiliarize himself with the area and to pick up some ingredients for his mother from a store she gave him directions to in the market. He had just arrived at the scene of the massacre, which was the only way he could think to describe what he was seeing, just in time to see Mirko take the hit for one of the civilians getting led out of a building ready to fall over on itself at any time. He took a moment to take his hooded cloak out of his bag to hopefully prevent any still functioning cameras from getting a positive ID on him, and made his way over just as the hero with rabbit ears was being backed into a corner. "Hey, meathead," he called out, getting the man's attention as quickly as he could to avoid any more injuries for the woman who was panting and hopping up and down on one foot and holding her left arm still with her right. Both combatants turned to see who had arrived, the hero frowning because she didn't want to accept help and the villain glaring at whoever dared to get in the way of the best fight he'd gotten all day. "What do you want, punk? I'll kill you right after I finish with this speech," the insane man shouted, his head already turning back to his current target to continue his assault. "Whoever you are, help the others get the civvies out. I'm fine here with this weakling." Mirko shouted and lowered her posture again in an attacking stance on her one good foot. Izuku shook his head at the two fighters and called out again, "Hey, meathead. I came here to give you a choice, big guy." Muscular stood up straight and turned to keep both people in his line of sight and gave a deranged laugh in response. "Okay, you've got my attention, man. Just know if I don't like what comes out of your mouth next, you are dying first." Mirko looked ready to scream at the hooded figure to get out of the area and to stop distracting her, but Izuku headed her off. Yeah, your approval doesn't really mean anything to me. Now then. You've got two choices." He paused as the villain seemed to put his focus more squarely on him, and he noted the false eye the guy was wearing. Option 1. You surrender and come quietly. This option means you get to leave the situation with no further injuries or changes to your body and mind, then you go to prison and live out your life there doing whatever it is prisoners do. Muscular looked a little constipated, seemingly not quite sure if he wanted to snarl or laugh at the first option. Option 2. Izuku continued, completely ignoring the fact that Muscular had turned fully towards him and that Mirko looked to be tensing every muscle group she had available for use. I get to take you down in whatever creative way I can come up with on the spot. Possibilities include but are not limited to turning you into a rabbit, burning and cauterizing your body, freezing you in place and impaling you with spears of ice, causing instant frostburn across the entire surface of your body, locking various appendages in separate dimensions, and finally, working through some aggression I've been pushing down for the last couple of months since my last good fight. The choice is yours to make my deformed adversary. Anyone who happened to hear the second option was currently either silently staring at the newcomer or sputtering out nonsense as they laughed at the diversity of possible takedown methods. Hero and villain alike were in the second camp, with Muscular coughing a little and trying to demand a fight as per his usual. Izuku noted the man's cough down as possible smoke inhalation from being surrounded by fires, and the smoke backdraft was causing as he put out those fires, not really needing the handicap but making sure he was aware of it all the same. Soon enough Izuku got his answer when Muscular leaped towards him in a burst of speed that honestly surprised him. Show me your blood. Give me a decent fight. Die. The first strike, a wild right haymaker, was easily dodged, Izuku having rotated around the blow to the outside of the villain's outstretched arm and rapidly struck several points on the arm as he moved. Once Muscular tried pulling the arm back to backhand Izuku, he noticed that the arm was no longer responding to his directions and was hanging limply to his side. He was distracted by his arm for only a moment before reacting on instinct by launching a roundhouse kick behind himself, expecting Izuku to duck the kick so he could smash him into the pavement with a follow-up punch. What he wasn't expecting was for Izuku to catch his leg, far less muscled than his upper body and arms, to keep his mobility as high as possible, but still several times stronger than a normal peak human's kicking force. He stared as Izuku simply held his shin with his left hand and raised his right hand balled into a fist with his middle finger knuckles slightly raised, and rapidly tapped several places on Muscular's calf, and he got halfway up the man's thigh before having to back off as the villain retaliated with a spin on his still grounded foot, which had his limp arm swinging at Izuku's head at incredible speed. Izuku leapt backward, steadied his balance before moving back in and sweeping the leg he had just partially disabled while feigning a bicycle kick that could have taken Muscular out of the fight had it connected. As the mass of muscle was falling on his butt, Izuku moved in and slammed his palm into the inside bend of the villain's right leg. Having just been holding up the man's weight, it was still locked in place by the dense musculature. There was a sickening crack as his palm struck his target, and it was followed with another palm strike to the disabled right elbow, resulting in another crack and a groan of pain from the downed villain. Izuku stepped back and admired his handiwork for a moment as Muscular rolled onto his side to nurse his broken joints as he tried to use his muscle generation quirk to pseudo-splint the two limbs so that he could get back into the fight. Unfortunately for him, Izuku had already moved to the man's other arm and let loose a powerful kick to his left elbow, which joined his right in the freshly disabled appendage club. He'd workshop the name later. At this point not even 10 seconds had passed from the moment Muscular had charged his new target, and Mirko had initially been more than ready to step in, bad leg and arm or no, but resisted when she watched him dodge the first punch. She had been entranced at the absolute demolition of the man she had been ready to go down fighting against, and was now watching the newcomer ready another axe kick aimed at the final knee, and saw the contrail following the arc, his foot carved through the air just as his armored boot connected with the back of the knee joint, and another crack was accompanied by a wet squelching sound that only people who had had the misfortune of hearing the membrane lining the knee joint rupturing could recognize. It was a leg-ending injury. No matter what else happens in Muscular's future, his left leg would never function the same again. Mirko was willing to bet the hit had pulverized the cartilage and the ligaments as well. Izuku stood back up and dusted off his hands, staring at the downed man who was now howling in pain. He didn't feel bad, necessarily. He knew he could have been a lot worse, and Muscular himself would certainly have shown no mercy, but permanently injuring someone never sat right with him. Probably a holdover from his hero worship days that the various wars he'd taken part in hadn't quite gotten rid of, and was now rearing its head in his home dimension where the laws were far more strict. Shaking his head, he regarded the man again as he decided to offer him a reprieve from the fight. He couldn't move anymore after all. So, ready to go quietly now, meathead? Muscular was clearly more deranged than he had thought, though. He watched as the man's quirk was still working to splint the damaged joints while the man began screaming through the pain, and, if you paid close enough attention and filtered out the profanity, you could sort of make out what he was saying. F you. You piece of trash. When I get up I'm killing you, and then I'll find out who you were and where your family lives, and they'll be my next targets. I don't care if I have to break out of prison again, I will crush their bodies and bathe in their blood. Now, Izuku could excuse a lot of things said in pain and anger. Threatening his family wasn't on that list though. His eyes narrowed as he cast a silencing spell and watched all of the villain's extra muscle fibers recede back under his skin, the man now confused but still unable to move and now screaming about Eraserhead being AD, and interrupting his fight again. Izuku chuckled, which caught Meathead's attention. Oh no. That wasn't Eraser. That was me. I silenced your quirk for the next minute. Wanted to be as precise as possible for this. Muscular was going to shout at him to explain and turn his quirk back on so he could kill him faster, but he was interrupted by a gasp from the forgotten rabbit hero that was followed by a pain unlike anything he had ever felt before on his spine between his shoulder blades. After the pain came a complete numbing feeling from his shoulders down. All of the pain he felt from his joints being targeted before was gone, but so was all of the rest of his feeling below the neck. He turned his head, staring up at the cloaked figure who had already started walking away towards the rabbit woman he was fighting before, and tried to get up to blindside him but found he couldn't move a muscle. Realization began to dawn on him. This guy had paralyzed him. He didn't know if it was a temporary thing like how he somehow disabled his quirk or a permanent injury, but either way he knew the fight was over. He put his head back down and rested his cheek on the warm pavement, giving him a good enough vantage point to watch as green mist started flowing around the man's hands as he held the rabbit's foot. He watched as the swelling went away and the discoloration vanished. Then he saw her put weight on the leg and bounce up and down a few times in excitement as the man did the same for her arm. Izuku had just finished healing the rabbit woman's injuries and was ready to move over to the triage site to help with first aid until more medical personnel could arrive, noting that the woman was watching his every move and occasionally glancing at the one responsible for all of the death and destruction, who was just laying there on the ground watching them as they moved. Izuku saw her eyes widen as she could now tell the extent of what he had done to the villain and seemed to approve. She moved towards the downed man and picked up his unmoving form after delivering a quick chop to the back of his neck to render him unconscious and carrying him over to the sound of approaching police sirens. Now that the main threat was taken care of and the person most likely to detain him was gone, Izuku relaxed as he moved to the medical evac point that had been set up and reviewed the injuries before sitting in the middle of the area and channeled healing mist into his surroundings, going for a wide area stabilization and treating the bruising most of the injured were dealing with. Once he was sure that the minor injuries had been dealt with, he moved to the more seriously injured and helped with the medical personnel who had arrived while he was treating the majority. Some time later, roughly 10 minutes into treating patients and helping load them into the ambulances as they arrived, the rabbit woman had shown back up and was watching him treating the wounded and stayed there for the next half hour as he worked until the last victims were dealt with and the medical staff were leaving. She was joined by several police officers and the other heroes on the scene, as well as a certain detective that Izuku was familiar with. He smiled at the trench coat wearing man and waved politely at him, noting the man's exasperated smile and a return wave as he covered the distance. Afternoon, detective. Did they already ID me and send you in personally? The officers and heroes looked very confused at this, and it told Izuku all he needed to know. No, I just happened to be the closest detective and was already in the area. I was originally going to help detain whoever was here making a mockery of quirk usage laws, but now that I know it's you, I'm in a bit of a bind. The detective sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose with his index and thumb as he started muttering under his breath. Izuku watched as the rabbit woman's ears twitched slightly in the detective's direction and her face warped with incredulity. Well, technically you didn't break any laws. But you know that once the loophole is closed you can't keep doing this, right? Izuku nodded and gave the man a thumbs up. I'm well aware. It won't be a problem though. Nizu-san is helping me fix the issue in a few days and I'll be free to help out whenever I happen to come across this sort of thing whenever I need to. He did drill it into my head though that under no circumstances was I allowed to let the HPSC know who I was until then though, so I'm afraid if you've got nothing else for me I really should be going. Tsukachi simply sighed again and muttered slightly louder something about a rat before waving Izuku off and watching as he teleported away. Izuku knew the man was going to be swamped with questions about him, but he also knew the detective wouldn't put him in danger, so his identity was safe for now and he just needed to go find a different store for dinner supplies or he could provide dinner tonight. Actually, that sounded like a better option since he wasn't really in the mood for the curry his mother was planning for tonight. So he simply stepped back up to his door and walked inside, removing his boots and hood on his way further in and putting his cloak away in his bag again as he rounded the corner to his parents sitting on the couch in the living room staring at him with the news replaying footage of the incident. Sheet. Various POV. The promised day had arrived and Izuku found himself enjoying a cup of tea with Nizu and a large anthropomorphic panda. The sight was a strange one for the people who walked in afterwards, that was for sure. I must thank you, Nizu-san. This tea is wonderful and the pastries you provided as an accompaniment were paired beautifully, the panda said as Aizawa and Midnight walked in, Yagi just behind them as the last to arrive. Nizu, always happy to receive a compliment for his tea, beamed in return, you're quite welcome, Sai-san. I'm honored to host a craftsman of your skill anytime. It's good to have your craft recognized, eh? Next time I visit I'll bring some ale and noodles, we'll dine like kings. Tsai-san? Said in response. Now, I believe it's time for me to get going. Please don't hesitate to ask Izuku here to pass on requests or messages. I'm always happy to help aspiring craftsmen and women, the panda said as he stood up and bowed respectfully to the dean before moving to the portal that Izuku had just motioned into existence. By Master Tsai. Izuku waved enthusiastically as their guest left the room and the portal faded. Hello everyone, long time no see. The faculty nodded in greeting and a short old woman moved towards him while eyeing him up and down with a critical eye for several long moments. So you're the one who healed Aizawa-kun and Ainen-chan? I'm very interested in watching the procedure to heal Tashinori. I hope to learn what I can in the future about some form of healing magic as well, seeing as your version doesn't use up your patient's stamina, she said and gave the young man a nod when he gave her a respectful bow. No problem, recovery girl. I'd like to say that my healing on its own would be able to heal him and maybe, with a lot of time and practice, it could. But for now, I don't want him to suffer any more than he already has. I've already spoken with Alexstrasza and she has agreed to help as long as she gets to explore the campus and try some of the food native to this world. Nizu-san has agreed to her terms, so we were just waiting for everyone else to arrive. Izuku said, bringing his gaze up to Yagi's as he finished speaking. He could see the light of hope in the older man's eyes and was glad that he was able to provide aid to the man who inspired his younger self so many years ago. He motioned for everyone to move away from the corner he used last time and began conjuring the portal again. Roughly a minute later a familiar blue portal swirled into existence and before Izuku had time to go through and escort this Alexstrasza, a tall red-haired woman dressed in red-scaled armor with gold trim and black accents with large horns extending from her temples outwards and upwards. She gave off a sense of life and majesty as she moved and came to a stop in front of the young mage and extended an armored hand which he shook with a fond smile. Hello young Izuku. It is good to see you again. Would it be alright if we saw to our patient quickly so that I may sample the food items here? I've made sure to have a healthy appetite. Izuku simply nodded and checked with Nizu about when the food would be ready. Getting affirmation that it was already done, he led the woman over to Yagi, who was still trying to be respectful to the woman who was both incredibly beautiful and, reportedly, exceedingly powerful. He snapped back to attention when the young man asked him to remove his shirt so they could look at the wound again and obliged, seeing the slits of the woman's pupils dilate slightly as the gnarled wound made an appearance. Well, I can see why it would give other healers trouble. Alexstrasza said as she leaned forward to examine it closer. Thankfully it's not so bad that I can't heal it. I'll just be a little tired afterwards. Had we met a decade ago I would have been able to wave my arm and heal you immediately. This time will take a few minutes at least, she finished while motioning for Yagi to sit down in a chair and moving a chair for herself to sit in front of him and placed her palms outstretched towards him, her intentions clear as he placed his over her own. She smiled and told him not to move as she closed her eyes and began to chant in a language no one there could understand. The other occupants of the room remained silent for her to maintain concentration, though Izuku did conjure a flask of mana tea for her to drink after she finished casting. Soon enough green and golden wisps of light began to radiate from the wound, starting from the center and moving outwards to encompass the full extent of the wound, and several other areas of his body shone faintly as well, including his left foot, which Aizawa had noticed him favoring since yesterday. As time went on the glows grew brighter until a few minutes later the radiance began to fade and everyone was able to see his wound shrinking visibly. It was a strange thing to witness as his chest and side seemed to fill back in on itself, though it did seem to cause him some discomfort for the remaining few minutes. Once the glow had faded entirely he took a deep breath, one that would have caused blood to spray from his mouth earlier this morning, but now he was able to slowly exhale again as normal. He waited until the woman in front of him retracted her hands from his and moved to drink the tea she was provided before he looked down and patted his abdomen down and smiled in relief. He then did something that made Recovery Girl move to whack him in the shins when he buffed up into his All Might form, surprising the dragon just a bit. Ha 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 ha. I can breathe again. I don't feel like my quirk is trying to rip me apart anymore. You have my most sincere of thanks, Lady Alexstrasza. If there is anything I can do for you while you're here, or if you need help later on, please do not hesitate to ask, he yelled out boisterously, clearly very happy with his regained health as he hoped to convey just how thankful he was at receiving her assistance. Alexstrasza, for her part, simply chuckled a little as she finished her cup of tea and stood gracefully. It was hardly any trouble that a good meal wouldn't fix. Speaking of that meal, I am now famished. May I ask that we retire to the dining quarters? She lay her hand above her stomach as a loud gurgling sound emanated from her. Nizu hopped out of his chair and climbed onto Aizawa's shoulder as he gestured for the group to make way to the cafeteria, doing his best to point things out on the campus as they walked to get a head start on her tour while they walked. He was ecstatic that his friend and colleague was back to working condition, even if he would need to eat and train quite a bit to regain his former stature. What Nizu wasn't expecting, however, was seeing just how much food the dragon could put away. Though he supposed he should have known better. According to Izuku, her full size is enormous, so the several hundred pounds of food she was currently polishing off was likely a normal-sized meal for her. Lunch Rush was happy when she praised his food though, so he had very little trouble looking past the sheer amount consumed. This was made easier once All Might and Recovery Girl returned from running a few tests. And the man said he'd pay for everything she ate while she was on Earth in thanks. Sure, Nizu had the money to provide this meal, but one doesn't become one of the richest beings on the planet by giving away huge chunks of money. He counted today as a total success. Yagi was healed, a being of incomparable might was pleased with her compensation for healing their current strongest hero, and Izuku had already accepted the job offer. He had even introduced Nizu to several of his teachers and acquaintances who were more than willing to stop by to teach their own crafts to whoever wanted to learn. He did have the slight problem of needing to send his students out to their world to obtain the materials necessary for their crafts, but he supposed that was more than fair. If he could outfit his faculty and even just the hero course with those bags or the enchantments that had been shown to him, he would consider the trade more than profitable for their needs. Keeping his people safe was his job as the leader after all. The rest of the day, including the tour for his guest, it was all Nizu could do to contain his excitement at the thought of a school full of people who had methods that no one else could prepare for to combat crime and provide aid to those who needed it. He took special care to keep up his friendly visage for the dragon, though he was certain she knew it was simply an approximation of his to imitate human facial features. She had, on more than one occasion so far, nodded to him when no one else was watching as his ever-present smile dropped to his natural face briefly. He hoped to see this woman again in the future to discuss their history at length. The stories young Izuku had told him already, from history books or a second-hand retelling, were already fascinating after all. As the sun was starting to set, Izuku reopened the portal for their guest, who shook hands with everyone, until it was Izuku's turn, who she smirked at and gave a hug to instead, pushing aside his hand he had brought up for a shake. To his credit, the young man only froze for a moment before returning the hug and promising to keep in touch. As the portal closed, he turned back to the staff and looked confused at the looks he was getting for a moment until he clued in. No. Alexstrasza and I are good friends, that's all. She already has a mate and the age gap is frankly staggering. Oh, then who have you set your eyes on, young man? Midnight, predictably, asked in her SNSL tones. Izuku seemed confused for a moment again before replying, no one yet. He said, as if were obvious, I was so busy learning and training to survive and looking for a way home that I never looked for love. I have been approached before, yes, but I explained myself to them all and let them know why I couldn't be in a relationship until I had exhausted all means of returning home first. Nizu could understand that. Though he did have to give the man praise for ignoring his hormones for so long, surrounded by people who were all in a position of not knowing whether or not they'd return home from the next battle. Midnight, however, seemed to latch onto something else entirely. Oh, so now that you've made it back to Earth and have a means of traveling back and forth, do you have anyone in mind? Izuku brought his hand up to his chin in what was clearly his thinking pose. I suppose there are a few people I wouldn't mind being with, but some of those are already off the market since their previous offers, and I'm not entirely certain how we'd go about keeping up our relationship on two different planets. They'd need to be willing to come to Earth for me to consider it, or I'd have to find someone here. I'm not willing to live on Azeroth for the rest of my life, no matter how hard I fought to protect her or how much blood I shed defending her and repelling invaders. Earth is my home. My partner or partners would need to be okay with that. Nizu tuned out the conversation going on around him, handing the young man a packet detailing when and where he'd need to go for his licensing exam from the HPSC so that he could use his abilities in emergencies and could legally be a hero. He had already gotten a teaching license to him before everyone else showed up, so now it was time to continue planning for the new classes he was excited to introduce, and he now had several other possible teachers ready and willing to pass on their knowledge. The future was looking brighter already. A brief but harsh knock sounding from the door was all the warning Nizu had gotten from his security system before the automated recognition software allowed the person in. He had just been enjoying a cup of tea while staring out over his domain previously, and while his innate animal traits had recognized that there was someone approaching his office, he hadn't bothered to check to see who it was since they weren't triggering his instincts for danger. He simply wanted to continue looking out through the floor-to-ceiling reinforced windows overlooking the university grounds for a little longer and, if it just happened to be one susceptible to his antics, throw off whoever had barged in by seeming more nonchalant. He was more surprised than he wanted to let on when a feminine voice spoke to him, as he had very few female staff members and this didn't sound or smell like any of them. He focused his vision on the glass to see the tips of furry white ears in the reflection behind his comically large office chair, one that he will deny getting just to cause people to do double takes, and it took marginally longer than normal to identify the human he couldn't see. Marginally, relatively speaking, meant just under half a second as opposed to the 1/10 of a second it normally might have. Nizu. I need information and I'm pretty sure you have it. The question was called out in a slightly brusque voice that he could tell was used to barking out orders and getting information quickly and concisely. He didn't need to turn around to see his visitor, but he respected her as one of his more promising students from just a couple of years ago, and she was doing phenomenally in her new position. Miss Usagiyama, it's a pleasure to see you again, my dear. Tell me, Nizu greeted as he slowly made the chair rotate with a small touchpad he operated discreetly using his tail. To what do I owe said pleasure of your visit? The woman, Usagiyama Rumi, better known as the rookie hero Mirko, huffed good-naturedly and smiled at the dean in a belated greeting before restating her request, though in a more polite tone. I need information, Nizu, and I know you have what I'm looking for, as your name was used during the incident. This didn't really narrow down the scope of what she could be asking of the redacted, as the number of incidents that occur each day where his name is mentioned is monumental. My dear, I'm afraid you're going to need to explain what you mean to this senile old man. They shared a laugh as no one, not even Nizu himself, knew his exact age, nor was anyone sure how long he was going to live, so the running joke around campus was that he was still an infant in his species even if he'd been teaching for nearly half a century. 2 days ago I responded to a call about a rampaging villain in the market street here in Musurifu. The villain in question was Muscular, and as much as I hate to admit it, he had me on the ropes due to having to take hits to protect the civvies and the rescue heroes working to evacuate the area. Rumi began with a typical report that she'd given the commission just after the incident in question and continued, just as I was going to be either sent to the hospital or the morgue, someone stepped in and intervened. I called out to try to get him to vacate since I didn't recognize him and didn't know if he was a civvy or a lower-ranked unknown hero, hoping to get some good press, but he ignored me and pulled the villain's attention onto himself and offered an ultimatum. Obviously, Muscular didn't take the peaceful surrender option. Nizu chuckled at the thought. What followed was a very brief but brutally efficient takedown from the unknown man that left the villain with a permanent disability in his left leg. The villain threatened to escape prison and track down the man's family to, and I quote, crush their bodies and bathe in their blood. I had been prepared to step in at this point, not sure what I would have done, but the stranger beat me to it by somehow disabling Muscular's quirk and crushing one of the vertebrae in the villain's spine, paralyzing him before healing me and moving to assist triage. Nizu knew what Mirko was referencing when she had mentioned the Market Street incident, but let her continue the report out of respect for her professional demeanor. He also knew what she wanted to ask and just so happened to have something he could ask for in exchange. He was a little surprised when Tsukachi had given him an advanced copy of the report from the incident at just how efficiently Izuku had been in his handling of the matter and how diverse his skill set had been, and couldn't wait to get him to start teaching others at his school to do the same. Rumi kept speaking, oblivious to the dean's thoughts on the matter. I had stayed after delivering Muscular to police custody to keep an eye on the man as he worked with the medical support, and was joined about 10 minutes later by the rest of the still-moving heroes and police, along with a newly arrived detective who made some strange remarks that I want clarification on before letting the guy off on technicality. Not that I want to get the guy in trouble, he really did save myself and a lot of other lives that day, but I want to know what loophole he exploited to get off without so much as a slap on the wrist for what was clearly vigilantism. Nizu considered for a moment as to how much he should tell the young woman. He obviously wouldn't tell her the full story, but maybe he could get her to agree to help in exchange for it. It would certainly help to have a combat specialist on hand for Izuku's licensing exam after all. Well, Mirko, unfortunately I can't divulge all of the information right now, as it's incredibly highly classified information known only to the staff here at UA and the detective you ran into on scene. Rumi sighed, having known she wasn't likely to get the information she was hoping for. However, Nizu continued, and Rumi's head raised up again to meet his gaze. If you'd be willing to assist in a combat evaluation in 2 days' time for a certain acquaintance of mine to obtain his hero license, I'm sure the information you're looking for might just find its way into your capable hands. He grinned as he finished his request, dropping enough hints that she should understand what he hadn't said outright. Rumi's smile turned into a fierce grin, excited both at the concept of a battle trial and at the understanding of Nizu's hidden message that the man she was looking for was likely the one being tested, as he had mentioned getting around the loophole that would be closed with Nizu's help in a few days. I'm always up for a good fight, Dean Nizu. Just email me the time and place and I'll be there. That Friday was a hectic one, at least the morning was so far, for Izuku. He had long gotten past the point where anxiety would keep him awake at night, his frequent close calls with assassins and years of admonishment from Turunju and Khadgar along with the help he got from the Pandaren who helped raise him in his youngest years on Azeroth and the Kyrians in the most recent years, had quashed that bad habit over time. He slept a full 8 hours every night in peacetime and spent 2 hours from dawn till breakfast time doing his exercises to keep in shape, then had a hearty breakfast full of protein and carbs for long-lasting energy throughout the rest of the day, then got dressed and made his way to the subway station to get to the facility that had been booked for his exam. He was nervous, though years of experience were helping to offset those nerves and his tactical mind was going over all of the information he'd gathered in the short time he'd been back on Earth regarding hero law and procedure. He arrived a full half-hour early for the appointment and signed in, simply being asked to wait for the agreed time in the meeting room as not everyone was ready yet, so he sat down on the floor and meditated until the proctors entered, gave him a simple written exam, and then explained his practical once he had handed in the written. You will be tested on your combat ability, rescue operation knowledge, and triage acumen since you have listed yourself as a combat medic. We have prepared 3 examiners for each test and your final score will be an amalgamation of your scores given by each evaluator separately. None of them will be watching the other's test being taken to prevent bias. There will be an hour break between the 3 different test types for you to rest and recuperate if you need to. Do you have any questions? Explained a very tired-looking man whose badge read, Miru. Izuku only had 2. First, is each test going to be the same across the 3 examiners for each type or will they each be creating a scenario? Second, am I allowed to use any of my gear or items in these tests or are there any restrictions? He asked as he remained seated and relaxed to help calm his remaining nerves. The proctor, Meru, sighed and picked his head up off the desk where it had fallen in what looked like an attempt to get some sleep that the man desperately needed. Each examiner has elected to create their own scenario in the interest of testing you on different things. As far as items and gear goes, nothing lethal and you may only use what you brought with you. You cannot request things from us. Think of it as forcing you to be prepared for whatever the job throws at you. Izuku grinned at this, the proctors unsure why as they hadn't seen him bring any gear other than the strange armor he wore into the building and a set of pouches hanging from his hip. They had come up with the limitation out of spite as the higher-ups wanted to inconvenience Nizu's recommendation as much as possible without showing their bias against him. They themselves were also a little tired of the Chimera's antics and refusal to offer the information they wanted about this man who came out of seemingly nowhere. The young man simply stood up and headed for a door they had marked as Battle Trial 1, without saying another word, and they all turned to the monitor bank hooked up to each exam site. As Izuku walked in, he was greeted by a man not much older than himself wearing an aviator jacket and stylish pants that were subtly armored in ways that made them look like normal clothing. His real defining feature, however, were the enormous red feathered wings that he kept loosely tucked around himself as he stood in the middle of the street they had constructed empty housing to the sides of, likely to simulate fighting a villain in a suburban area. The man waved and introduced himself. Sup. I'm Hawks and I hear you're something else. I want to test your combat ability against a flying target and see what you can do. Izuku wasn't even able to respond before Hawks was in the air starting to form high winds as his wings flapped, feathers seeming to fall from them towards the floor in different directions. Izuku, had he been less experienced, may have ignored the feathers on the ground in favor of focusing on the villain in the field. Thankfully, Izumi had already shown him a clip of the man in front of him diving at him through the air for whatever reason instead of keeping his distance. It wasn't until he noticed a glint coming from one of the victims and the woman he was supposed to rescue, who merely began berating him about not needing saving, that he realized the trap the winged man had set. His pensive face shifted rapidly. The woman who'd been talking stuttered to a stop and grinned as she saw they'd been found out. Izuku's smirk had been a mark of victory for his forces near the tail end of the war against the Legion and all throughout the campaign against the jailer. Whenever a comrade saw it, they knew they had already won or were about to, and when an enemy saw it, they knew to send more assassins next time. There may not have been any of his troops around, but the ones present could feel the confidence rolling off of the young man, and they knew he was about to pull off something insane. They were right. It'd take several months for any of them to even reference something other than what they were about to witness when asked about cool stuff that happened at work that day. When Hawks had made it roughly halfway to Izuku and the feathers glinting in the lights shining down from the ceiling were set to arrive at the same time as whatever attack the long-range fighter coming into CQC range had come up with was, Izuku raised his arms, which had begun to release mist in his immediate area. As Hawks came closer, he reached both hands to opposite sides and grabbed a long feather in each hand before dragging them across each other in a double horizontal slash, the flying feathers all performing some variation of a sword swing or stab, hoping to lock him into one place to end the fight in an instant. Unfortunately for them, Ice Block exists. The spectators watched as a solid block of ice engulfed the young man milliseconds before the blades were to hit, completely stopping and in some cases encasing the feathers within the same ice protecting the test taker. Hawks himself was stunned that his blades couldn't cut through the block and he couldn't retrieve any of the ones that had gotten stuck. He was all set to wait out the timer on the chunk of ice when it exploded outwards in a rough circle, the chunks vanishing before they could hit any of the civilians. The winged hero noted that he couldn't see the target anymore as one of his feathers picked up a vibration behind him. He couldn't even make a full rotation before everything went black and he lost consciousness. Hawks came to on the floor in the proctor's room after what felt like only a few seconds, but that was strangely accompanied by a small pillow, and the proctors were looking at either him or the bank of screens showing the man he was supposed to suppress and detain, for the HPSC president going toe-to-toe with Endeavor by manipulating the flames he threw at him to swing back around to Endeavor. It devolved into a fist fight once the flame hero determined that his flames weren't going to work on the mystery man, and unfortunately for the hero he was vastly outclassed in combat experience evidently. The fight lasted only another 12 seconds before the much larger man was on his knees with both hands held behind his back and his flames snuffed out somehow. The young man led his opponent into the room with Hawks and the proctors and left without saying a word while everyone else turned their attention back to the monitors. Izuku was eagerly awaiting the arrival of his last opponent. These guys were so different compared to his usual sparring partners or enemies, and he was having a lot of fun. Sure, turning a hawk into a rabbit didn't even make it into his top 10 funniest ways to disable a foe, but it was unique due to the look of confusion on everyone else's face when he brought a small white rabbit into the room and told them to wait a couple of minutes. Endeavor had been a fun fight for a bit until Izuku realized he didn't have control over his flames after releasing them, which was a bit of a letdown, but he still worked up a good sweat from the rising ambient temperature. He pet his head at the muffled sound of metal on scaffolding and looked up as his last tester jumped from the top of one of their fake buildings and landed gracefully by tucking into a roll to dissipate her momentum. He recognized this one. "Ah, Mirko. It's nice to see you again. I take it that you're my third opponent then?" Izuku asked her with a wide smile that she seemed to appreciate. She huffed a bit before returning the smile and responding, "It is good to see you, and I have a lot of questions I want to ask you afterwards, but right now I want to have a good fight. I'm not going to have any civilians around for you to protect or rescue, it's just you and me until one of us gives up or the timer runs out." Her smile had gone from returning the kindness his displayed to a manic grin towards the end of her statement that he couldn't help but match. He laughed, "That's more like it. Do you want any restrictions on styles other than non-lethal attacks?" She looked offended at that. "No. Stick to non-lethal and I want a straight-up brawl. No tricks, just pure ability." Izuku nodded and moved a few paces backwards before getting into his ready stance as she did the same. A buzzer went off that signaled the start of the fight and both of them blinked out of vision momentarily to those watching. They met roughly in the center with a leg hooked around each other's leg from a double backwards roundhouse kick opener. They paused only for an instant before pushing off each other to deliver a left knee from the rabbit hero and a right hook from Izuku, both attacks aimed at center mass from the combatants. Each fighter followed the attack up with a reversed rotation to make use of the remaining momentum and threw either a punch, an elbow, a knee, or a kick with each rotation, keeping pace with each other the entire time. The stalemate lasted until Mirko kicked off the ground during one of her reversals to alter the momentum into what would have been a devastating overhead axe kick had Izuku not seen her winding it up and spun around to her grounding side to land a low kick to the back of her supporting knee. Mirko attempted to lash out with the attacked limb as she fell forward and missed, but managed to use the time Izuku spent dodging to tumble forward and avoid a follow-up axe kick from the young man that left a short contrail through the air along its path and cracked the pavement on impact. Both fighters hopped back 2 paces and bounced on alternating legs for a moment as they searched for openings in the other's guard. The opening came when Mirko's left leg crumpled for a fraction of a second due to the kick he had landed on it after her failed axe kick. Izuku blurred in the rabbit hero's eyes and ended up on her right with a compact hook landing in her kidney. She doubled over for a moment before hitting the deck as he tried to follow up with a knee to her face. She transitioned from her drop by rotating upwards into a rising lariat that caught Izuku's left shoulder and sent him skidding backwards as she flipped back onto her feet, clutching her stomach just over where his hook landed and breathing heavily as he was gingerly nursing his shoulder but maintaining a defensive stance with minimal weak points. Both fighters smiled widely, the watchers staring at them in horror at the sheer physical prowess being displayed, as they each dropped into a fresh stance. Rumi could feel her instincts calling to her in ways that she had been quick to ignore ever since she had hit PBRTY at 11, and she decided to use the endorphins to fuel her energy reserves for the fight rather than think about how her quirk was screaming at her to get to know this possible mate better. She would tackle that issue after she won. Izuku could feel a shift in his opponent's emotions just now, but he'd think about that later. He had a fight to win and he was going to win it. He'd not been using any abilities so far other than his years of martial arts training and infusing his body with reinforcing chi to avoid his bones cracking or his muscles tearing from her kicks, and he wondered if she might like to see one of his favorites. "Hey Mirko," he called out, and she raised an eyebrow to indicate she was listening. "Wanna see a cool move?" The grin he got was one he'd only seen on the most battle-hungry warriors from the front lines. He didn't need a verbal response, she was ready. The two fighters shot out at each other again, their shins locking together and avoiding breaking each other's legs due to Mirko's enhanced legs and Izuku's chi reinforcements, and on the rotation that had begun Izuku rolled backwards under her knee, coming out, and used his upper body to spring his legs upwards, landing a solid kick to her chin that lifted her off the ground for a moment. The moment Izuku used to roll back onto his feet and bring his arms back in, keeping them pressed into his hips for a second before calling out, "Fists of Fury." Mirko's body was kept suspended in air for another 4 seconds by what looked like dozens, maybe hundreds, of palm strikes that she was unable to dodge until his attack ended and she crumpled in a heap, groaning in pain. She was barely able to bring an arm out to tap on the ground in the universal gesture of "I give up," and Izuku dropped his guard and moved to help her sit up as he started releasing renewing mist on her to help with the bruising and leading her into the observation room. The rescue and triage tests were nowhere near as fun as the fights, but he had no trouble acing those as well. The only issue he ran into was when they notified him that his ID was being printed and he could wait in the designated waiting room that just so happened to not be empty. A woman of average height was sitting in a chair at the only table in the room, and Hawks was standing just behind her to her right, clearly acting in a bodyguard role. The woman herself had ash blonde hair and her expression was somewhere between steely and expectant, like whatever was about to happen could only go as she planned. She met his gaze and gestured to the seat on the other side of the table from him. It didn't seem like a request, and Izuku was already not liking this woman. Midoriya Izuku, age 18, listed as a missing person when you were 8 years old and pronounced dead after 2 years of searching. Quirk, unknown, she rattled off with a bored tone to her voice. Izuku raised an eyebrow to this. "Yeah, that sounds like me. You either have a lot of money and don't mind hiring a private eye to gather information on me, or you're someone from the government attempting to throw her weight around," he responded in the same bored tone she used, not having any issues with being rude to someone who was clearly attempting to intimidate him. It was actually a little adorable. He had stared down demons hundreds of times. Fought 2 avatars of the old gods. Melee with an actual titan. This woman was nothing. A vein above the woman's right eye pulsed visibly at his rebuttal, and she schooled her features back into her mask. "Charming. I'm not here for pleasantries though. I am the president of the HPSC here in Japan, and I need information from you as well as your cooperation." Izuku chuckled at this. "Depending on what information you're looking for, I might answer a few questions. As far as my cooperation goes, that's going to depend on what you are hoping for. I already don't like the way you're trying to intimidate me by throwing around your title. A real leader doesn't do that." He actually heard the woman's teeth gnashing together for a second there, though she didn't drop her mask this time. "The information I need is about you. Where did you go for the last decade, and how are you able to use multiple quirks?" Izuku looked at the woman's eyes and noted the greed she tried so desperately to keep hidden. She had already gone onto his list of people to never work with. She wasn't getting anything from him. "Unfortunately, I don't feel like answering those questions." The woman raised an eyebrow at this, incredulity flashing across her face for a brief moment as she asked, "You would disobey a direct order from one of the nation's top government officials? Specifically the one in charge of issuing you the license you're here to obtain today? You actually did perform exceptionally well. It would be a waste not to give you what you've earned over a meaningless and pointless squabble. Tell me what I want to know and you'll have your ID." Now he didn't need any more personal evidence, but the audio his phone was recording was amazing and he didn't want it to stop. "I disagree. My refusal to answer your demands are neither pointless nor meaningless. From the beginning of our interaction you have done nothing but attempt to establish yourself as the one in charge here. You are the one asking me for information, you are the one asking for my assistance. Not the other way around. You felt the need to try to intimidate someone you know nothing about to get information that was obviously being withheld from you for what I now see was a perfectly justifiable reason. At this point I'm going through a checklist of cliché lines from a villain towards a captured sidekick trying to extract information about a hero on a Saturday morning cartoon. I can almost guarantee that at some point, soon, you're going to try to threaten my family. I'm going to cut you off there though. For one, all of the footage of today's tests were live streamed to Nizu's office in real time. He is, no doubt, backing up the video evidence of my trials here, and should I walk out of here without a license I am more than certain he will do something about it." The woman's face went from bored to angry to terrified as he spoke. Clearly Nizu is much better than he gave him credit for if they didn't know he was recording the tests. Izuku didn't give her any time to respond though. Second, my dear President, is the fact that you have 1 guard in the room and 3 more on the other side of both doors. I could have you vanish from the face of the earth before any one of the 7 of these men and women had a chance to retaliate. Not to mention I wouldn't feel the need to hold myself back to using non-lethal attacks during an obvious attempt at my life. The middle-aged woman actually seemed less scared at his second point, clearly not believing he could follow through on his threat. That was fine with Izuku, as long as she didn't do something stupid she can just keep on believing that. Finally, the third point. Izuku said as he leaned forward, his eyes glowing an incandescent green and obvious fury etched into his features. If you ever threaten my family or the people I am close to or become close to, I will make you wish for death. There isn't a place on this earth you could hide from me. I will find you. You will not be missed, he spat out, his voice echoing in the room despite the low volume he'd spoken in. Hawks had gotten into an aggressive stance the moment he had leaned forward, and the president had now finally seemed to realize she was dealing with a dangerous force. She looked into the glowing eyes before her and spoke again. Threats of violence aside, you seem to think you're the one in charge of this conversation. I can have you and connected parties dealt with very quickly. This is not a threat, you cannot dash. You are right. Izuku interrupted her, that wasn't a threat. Neither are you or any of your people. Hawks is lucky. I can tell he's a good person deep under whatever you've done to him to have him act as your dog. I would have already removed him like I removed the other 6 bodyguards. The president hurriedly tapped an earpiece and waited for a response. Responses she did not get. She looked at Izuku again and her mask was finally coming undone. You killed my men? I will have you arrested. The information I want will come to me while you rot in a private prison cell. Izuku chuckled. Killed? No, Madam President. I didn't kill your men. I simply sent them to Hokkaido. They are currently out of range of the short-range communicator you're using. I could have sent Hawks with them, but again, not a threat. The mask was now fully gone, her face had paled considerably. He heard a faint chatter coming from her person and she moved a hand to the other ear to press another communicator and listen to a report. Evidently whoever that was confirmed his words as she looked at him in hatred. Very well. Take your card. We will be in touch. You will not get away with threatening me, boy, she said scathingly. Honestly, Izuku was just glad she was going to be getting out of his face. He didn't like dealing with her type. Still though, one last bit of evidence for his collection. Hawks, why do you follow this woman? She's clearly a megalomaniac child throwing a tantrum when things don't go her way. The man looked back at Izuku pensively but didn't get to answer him as the president spat out her own reply. Do not answer him. I order you to ignore any and all questions from this villain from now on. This finally got a rise out of Izuku. Villain? Why, Madam President, I'm not the one trying to strong-arm information using intimidation and threats. You think I care about anything you have to say here other than the information I want? She shouted. It will only take a few hours to declare you a villain for killing my 6 guards during a violent rage at not receiving your hero license. Enjoy your last few hours of freedom, boy. Izuku couldn't stop the full-bellied laugh this time. Oh, that's just precious. He giggled a bit more. You think you're leaving this room with all of your authority and power intact after threatening my family and I? You are pretty dumb for someone with a position so high, you know? The president scoffed and turned her head away from him, the ravings of a soon-to-be prisoner. I will enjoy watching you breaking and spilling all of your secrets to our interrogators. Oh, so you even have trained torturers? That's adorable. He stopped for a moment and gestured with a hand pointing to his face from the direction she looked away to and waited for her to meet his gaze again. You're still an idiot. I already told you my test was being live-streamed to Nizu. Did you think he was the only one watching? The woman waved a hand at this, clearly not worried about anyone else. His smile stretched just a bit further. I was pretty surprised to find out that Nizu was on great terms with the Prime Minister, you know? I didn't mind if he wanted to sit in and watch my tests considering he was being brought up to speed on the information you were so gung-ho to obtain for yourself, and unlike you I didn't mind him knowing. She was far more engaged now that she knew the PM was involved. So what then? He saw the test, so what? I will just have to come up with another way to declare you an enemy of the state. It makes no difference to me. Izuku reached his hand up to a camera in the corner of the room, one whose indicator he had noted was off when he entered but was currently on again. Something that didn't escape the president's gaze either, as all the remaining color in her face drained in an instant. Oh yes. Our conversation was being watched by them as well. It's probably not a good image for you if your subordinates flippantly disregard your authority in the government. Doubly so when the president of the HPSC thinks the PM doesn't matter. Besides that, I have been recording the audio of our conversation since I walked in, he explained as he held up his phone, clearly showing the recording indicator on screen. You see, lady. I have dealt with your kind before. Just a bit of evidence goes a long, long way towards getting investigations set up. The door flew off its hinges, a rabbit's foot-shaped imprint clearly visible on it. Once I saw the guards get warped away, I also began recording. I dunno what all was said before that point, but I got plenty myself. Mirko added, her own grin a cross between vindication and willingness to assault. Izuku suddenly thought she was much more attractive. Hawks reached up to tap his own earpiece and smiled at the order he received. Madam President, or should I say former Madam President. You are under arrest for several things that I'm going to let the police who are currently waiting in the lobby to read out to you, he said as he slapped a pair of court-canceling cuffs on the nearly catatonic woman. He nodded at Izuku and Mirko and waved towards the camera in the corner before leading the woman out to police custody. Izuku gently elbowed the woman standing beside him. You know what, she grunted in reply, just for that stunt I'm gonna buy you lunch. Rumi turned to look at him with an eyebrow raised. Who says I want to go on a date with you? You look too young for me, boy. Huh. Miss Mirko, I never said anything about a date, he said with a sheet-eating grin as she dropped her own smirk and blushed heavily. Not that I'd be opposed to it, mind you. You're quite lovely and I'd love to get to know you better, but for now I just want to buy you lunch as thanks for being willing to stick your neck out for a stranger against someone who could have made things very hard for your future. Her blush receded a bit as she rolled her eyes and gave a small, genuine smile. In that case, sure, let's go get lunch, she said and turned to lead the way to a small hole in the wall place she was familiar with in the area, having patrolled here a few times. She was not, however, above messing with the guy a bit, so she put a bit more of a sway to her hips as she walked and looked over her shoulder. Better hurry up or the lovely lady is going to leave without you, kid. Yeah. Izuku was finding her more attractive by the minute. Wonder if it's too soon to court someone from Earth. As far as diners go, Izuku was certain this was one of the hidden gems. He'd heard about these kinds of places back on Azeroth. Little holes in the wall on streets they don't seem to belong on, usually ran by a goblin and staffed by people who care, but that's beside the point. He was currently trying his best to keep up a good impression for the beautiful woman he was having lunch with while also devouring a bowl of beef noodles. Her smirk was both encouraging and embarrassing. They had left the testing facility not too long ago and she had told him to keep up if he could before jumping off in a flash. He would have absolutely been left behind had he not already put an arcane tracer on her. As it was, he simply waited until he felt the mark stop moving and teleported to her location, nearly causing a traffic accident in the process, but he didn't want to talk about that. So, the woman began as she was enjoying her own bowl of vegetable stir-fry. I actually volunteered to be one of the combat testers for your exam, you know? Oh? He didn't know that. He'd give her a verbal response if he wasn't currently slurping a particularly long strand of delectable noodle, so he simply shook his head a bit and squinted his eyes a little. Yeah, I was there when you took down Muscular a while back and wanted to know more about you, but everyone I asked was under NDA to not discuss you. I eventually stopped by Nizu's place and he hinted that if I were to participate in today's exams I might learn a few things. I took the hint. Now I want to know, the rabbit woman said, obviously trying hard to keep her voice down but failing to stop herself from slapping the table towards the end. Where'd you learn to fight like that? How are your legs okay after we fought? Why did Muscular's quirk stop working that day? Finally, why does it feel like you have multiple quirks? Izuku was actually proud of that geyser of questions. It's not often that he's on the other side of one of those. Just as well he finished his current bite, so time to answer what he can. In order and without saying things I'm not yet allowed to say. I had several amazing teachers. I'm reinforcing my legs with a special kind of energy. I made it so he couldn't use it for a minute, and I can't answer the last one without giving away information that I promised Nizu and the Prime Minister I wouldn't tell anyone. Though I can say I don't have multiple quirks. He paused there, still thinking about anything else he could add while skirting the rules when his communicator, it's a watch connected to a phone you dumbass, vibrated and he rotated his wrist to check on it. Ms. Usujiyama will be read in on the specifics tomorrow if she agrees to the offer I just made her. Nizu. He looked up just in time to see her ears twitch and she reached into a small pouch on her waist for a phone to check briefly. Her eyes scrunched up a bit at first, obviously not happy about something, before they widened and she shot a glance at him. He just grinned at her in return, and she searched his face for several seconds before looking back at her phone to respond to the text. All right, you can keep your secrets for the day, she grumbled. He would swear if you asked that he didn't have a glint in his eye. Enough of that though, how's the grub? Oh, I quite like this. Where I have been, at least for the first few years I ate mostly noodle dishes, and it's been a long while since I've had the time or peace to have leisurely meals like this one until just recently. I'm currently de-stressing from about a decade of, let's call them, issues popping up, he said as he went in for another bite, his chopsticks expertly grabbing the perfect amount of noodles for his mouth size. He really liked the beef in this dish too. It had a slight tang to it which he guessed came from some form of citrus added in the marinade, but he would give the chef peace for the day since he was out with someone and wouldn't harass him or her for the recipe. Mirko looked at him strangely due to his reply, clearly trying to put together a story in her head to explain what he could have possibly been hinting at before shaking her head, no doubt considering it a futile effort seeing as she would learning about it tomorrow anyway. Good. I found this place the day after I started doing solo patrols, she said as she finished another bite. I had helped another newbie hero and to thank me she brought me here, said she grew up in the area and this was her favorite place to worry about eating too much at. She chuckled at the memory as she explained it to the guy doing his best to keep his food in his mouth as he choked through the laughter. Sorry, he sputtered eventually, it's just funny because most of the people I lived with for the first few years I was gone had no qualms about body weight and would constantly ask if I was eating enough when I never gained any substantial weight beyond muscle mass. I still haven't figured out how those people fight so well while being so fat. He glanced at her as her face was currently a mix of amusement, slight indignation at the perceived dig, and what could only be described as the human bunny form of a chipmunk or a squirrel with full cheek pouches. Oh, don't give me that look. To them being fat is a sign of health. Not only would they not take offense to me calling them fat but they would laugh and say thank you, he finished with a nod of his head as he stared off into the distance while remembering the kids at the monastery. She nodded as she continued to deal with the too much food in her mouth so he decided to bring up another topic. I noticed you seem to really enjoy a good fight. Was that something that comes natural for you or is a learned response? I've met plenty of battle junkies who were born that way or raised that way as well as several who trained themselves to be that way and it's always kind of interesting to see which kind each person is. Mirko tilted her head a bit and finished the food in her mouth. I'd say I probably taught myself to be this way, she said while looking off into the distance. When I was young I was picked on a lot because my quirk was too cute or didn't seem strong enough. Wasn't a heroic quirk they told me all the time. Said I'd never be able to be a hero with a quirk that just made me look like a bunny. Izuku took offense to that. He could distinctly remember being bullied for wanting to be a hero without a quirk so he wasn't happy about someone with a quirk being denied the same thing. I got fed up with hearing it from everyone and around the time I turned 8 or 9. Yeah, around then. I decided to prove them all wrong. I started training. Just a bit at first. Everyone said I couldn't push my body too hard while I was so young, though I now know that's not true, and gradually worked up to finding out that my quirk gave me some pretty impressive leg strength. At 10 I was squatting nearly a metric ton and had been asked not to use the non-reinforced leg presses when at public gyms. When I turned 12 I started jumping in to protect kids from bullies trying to beat them up for one reason or another and started taking Muay Thai classes so that I'd stop taking so many hits during the scuffles. I started to enjoy fighting for the sake of fighting around 13 or 14 I guess, she explained before looking back at him and asking her own question, when did you start learning to fight? Another minefield question, huh? When I was 8 I ended up somewhere where I didn't know anyone, he started and she looked at him with concern. I didn't have any friends or family with me there but luckily the locals were very friendly and had a tradition of training physically starting as young as 4 years old. I joined their lessons the same week I arrived as I knew I needed to learn to defend myself just in case. I learned the basics and what the locals could teach me in a little under a year when a prestigious teacher came to visit to recruit new students when fall began that year. He originally didn't want to even look at me, he had to stop there to make sure he didn't call Taranju a xenophobe again, racist when we first met and it was quite obvious I didn't come from around there. He saw her getting upset for him at this point and smiled to reassure her. He eventually agreed to test me. I passed and he agreed to take me as a student. Eventually he stopped hating me for my race and by the time I was 12 he told me I was one of his favorite students. High praise from him as up to that point most of us weren't sure he could show such a thing. Mirko laughed, a charming sound that he wouldn't mind hearing more often truth be told. I had been trained in 3 major styles by that time and was getting lots of practice in being a combat medic starting at the tail end of 12 and the beginning of 13 for me. I spent the next 6 years studying other things, fighting, training, and picking up new skills for survival. Izuku finished explaining what he could as vaguely as possible here and conveniently happened to slurp the last mouthful of noodles afterwards. He was sure of 2 things now. First, he wanted to continue spending time with this woman. Sure, he was a little younger than her but he doubted he could possibly bond with anyone his age from Earth because of his experiences. Second, he really wanted tomorrow to come so he could stop dancing around topics as to not alarm the public. Especially so that he could facilitate number 1. Maybe a third thing. He needed to speak with Khadgar and ask his opinion on the subject. Actually never mind, the man has no experience in courting anyone. He'll need to ask his friends from the army. Lots of them joined the army to help protect their homes and families, they should know a thing or two. Izuku managed to ask for Mirko's contact information without sounding like a, what's he word they use here? Creep? Yeah, without sounding like a creep. At the very least she didn't rebuke him or decline, so he counted it as a win. After saying goodbye and promising to speak again tomorrow, they separated and Izuku walked nonchalantly down the nearest deserted alleyway, checked for anyone following, any spying spells on him, and any of those camera things he recently remembered were supposedly everywhere nowadays, and when he gave himself the all-clear he teleported back home after a brief cast. His sudden arrival in the living room certainly didn't do his mother's heart any favors, as she was sitting on the couch not 2 meters away watching a cartoon with his sister, but he'll make it up to her. Probably with a bowl of nutritional but slimming chicken soup. He had asked if she was healthy what with the weight she had put on, and after she slapped him for mentioning a woman's weight she shyly explained that when he vanished she started stress eating and hadn't yet managed to lose all of it again. She was ecstatic when she learned that he knew several dishes that not only tasted good but helped one to lose weight. He explained that he had to figure out some way to not have the body type of a Pandaren, and showed her around the village that he spent his first year in and still uses as a home away from home to this day after casting every anti-scrying spell he knew, of course. There's no way he would jeopardize Earth with some entity locking onto his friends, family, or students in the near future. It's why he was going to prohibit his classes from selecting certain combat paths. In any case, his mother was very well received in Honeydew Village. Once the Pandaren learned she was his mother, they seemed to like her more because she was eager to learn some recipes from them. He wasn't going to tell them why. Anyway, Izumi decided that since he was home he was hers to command. She was, however, magnanimous enough to allow him to have a shower once she smelled how sweaty he was from the tests he had taken. He spent the rest of the afternoon with her and went to bed early, as he knew tomorrow would probably be draining. The next day began fairly early, with Izuku getting up at 3 to start his exercise routine and make breakfast for his family before taking a quick shower and teleporting to the front gate of UA at precisely 6 am as requested. He wasn't sure how he was going to get in without bypassing the security gate now that his guest pass had expired, when he noticed Aizawa laying against the wall in a large yellow sleeping bag, obviously attempting to appear asleep, but Izuku had plenty of experience watching enemy assassins playing dead to know when someone was faking it. The concrete can't be good for your body, Aizawa-san, he deadpanned. Aizawa, seemingly both annoyed and impressed that he was seen through, sat up and spoke to him as he picked himself up off the ground, without getting out of his sleeping bag somehow. I've slept on and in worse. Let's go, the rat is waiting. He then proceeded to hop through the gate that opened when he got close enough and led Izuku through the familiar route to the dean's office. Still without getting out of his sleeping bag. Izuku tried really hard to keep his face straight. He was fairly certain that laughing at your coworkers on your first day wouldn't make a good impression. He was once again let in before his knuckles could touch the door, not entirely certain if the door was mechanically set up to do so or if the dean did it manually, or if some spell was involved. He was pretty sure it wasn't the third thing, since no one here knew how to cast spells yet. Regardless, he walked into the room accompanied by his hopping escort and greeted his boss. Morning, Dean Nizu. Hope you're doing well today. I happen to be doing fantastically today, thank you, young Izuku. Now, as we happen to be short on time today, I must ask you both to accompany me to the meeting room, where we will be joined by the rest of the staff for a quick meeting before the students start showing up to classes early, the Chimera said as he jumped onto Izuku's shoulder and managed to stay balanced the entire trip down 2 flights of stairs and through 2 hallways with Aizawa trailing behind them. Still in his sleeping bag. Nizu leaned down a bit when he saw Izuku's face and whispered in his ear, he knows it's getting to you. He wants to see how you react to strange situations, and likely hopes to have formed a psychological profile on you as quickly as possible. He means no harm by it, he is merely distrusting of people in general and is fiercely protective of his students. Ah, that makes a lot more sense then. Izuku nodded and replied in the same whispered volume, that's all right. I've had much stranger things happen to and around me before. I've spent an entire day as a frog once when the shaman teaching me potions got upset at me for grinding the wrong root. Him hopping around like a jittery. I don't want to call him a maggot, so caterpillar like this is way down the list, though it is funny. They were unable to continue their conversation as they had arrived at their destination, and Nizu jumped off his shoulder and into the chair at the end of the table, and Izuku made his way to the seat with a small placard with his name on it and sat down to wait for everyone else. He decided to meditate as he hadn't had enough time to do so after his workout this morning and didn't see the harm in doing so here. Aizawa and Nizu both observed him as he closed his eyes and relaxed his body into the seat, arms resting on his chest, loosely crossed in a comfortable stature as small blue, purple, red, green, and white specks of some sort of energy began to slowly emanate and encircle his form. It was honestly a very intriguing sight to behold, and even took the attention of the others when they arrived as well. Nizu was tempted to stop 13 when they took out their phone to record the show but felt it would be too hypocritical as he was also recording the room through a dozen different cameras. Not long after, the last person walked through the door. That person happened to be Toshinori. Toshinori is not known for his subtlety. Greetings fellow UA faculty members. How on earth does he function in stealth missions? Izuku was jolted out of his meditation and had what appeared to be a flaming ball of ice hovering over his right hand and a yellow full-body-sized light shield in his left pointed towards the noise in less than half a second. His eyes wide as they scanned the room for threats for 3 seconds before he let out a long breath and cancelled his spells to pick up the chair he had flung out from under himself in his haste to enter a defensive position. Okay, that was my fault for meditating in a semi-public place. Sorry everyone, he said as he bowed and sat back down, his breath evening out rapidly as he did so, with a faint green glow that wasn't noticeable before fading out of sight. It's all good little listener. Though your reaction was a tad overkill, don't you think? Present Mike said as he held up finger guns to the young man who eyed his hands warily. He took another deep breath and tore his eyes away from the man's hands. You'll have to forgive me. I've developed a bit of a habit to get ready for combat at the slightest noise while sleeping or meditating. I guess the door was never closed so I didn't hear it shut or open and everyone else was quiet enough to not get picked up. Also, please don't do that thing with your hands in my general direction. I knew a troll who liked to fling lightning at me while sparring with the same gesture. Izuku explained with what he hoped was a disarming smile. To his credit, Mike did seem a little sheepish as he put his hands back to his sides and walked to his chair, which prompted the rest of them to follow suit. Izuku was surprised to see Mirko seated 2 chairs down from his left along with several other people he didn't recognize who were all glancing at him looking confused. He waved at her and smiled happily at seeing a familiar face which for some reason caused several of the people in the room to look away and mutter what sounded strangely like, "too bright," under their breath. Nizu stood up in his seat and called attention to himself to begin the meeting, which basically boiled down to introducing new staff members. He didn't know he wasn't the only one, including himself and Miss Usagiyama Rumi, which he belatedly realized was Mirko's actual full name. He sat through introductions for his new colleagues and noted any visually perceivable clues as to what they were capable of while waiting for his turn. He snapped to attention as the young lady next to him finished introducing herself. Bubble Girl? How does she expect that costume to protect her at all? He stood and bowed to the room. Hello everyone, I'm Midoriya Izuku, please call me Izuku or Archmage as I don't really answer to Midoriya anymore. I was hired to teach magic and a combat medic course. He bowed again and sat down in his chair before noticing that most of the people in the room were looking at him like he was an enigma. What? Is there something on my face? He asked as he reached up to wipe his face clean. Nizu chuckled a bit here. Relax, they're just confused. You jumped the gun a bit, but it makes for a decent segue into the first item on our list now that the greetings are done. Oh, he was the last one, huh? Nizu probably did that on purpose. You'll all find a neat little confidentiality agreement that I will need signed before we go any further. It's the standard agreement I give to all of my new teachers and the one I use for instances like this where classified information will be shared. The room was briefly filled with the sounds of papers rustling while people read the forms and eventually signed them and handed them up to the dean before he continued, "Thank you all. Now to address Izuku's comment on his classes. Izuku here was hired to teach our students, for now only the heroics course students, various forms of magic. Not the parlor tricks you might be thinking of but true, real, magic. He might inform you all of how he went about learning magic in the future but that would take up too much time right now, so let's continue with the meeting," he said as he blatantly ignored the looks Izuku was now getting from those who weren't present for his explanations or demonstrations. First off, we're going to be shifting some classes around to help make room for the new curriculum. Saturdays in particular might be mostly dedicated to magic lessons and Izuku can join the heroics lessons during the week to provide combat medic training during the exercises. As I've been informed, meditation is an important part of building up your body's magical reserves as we witnessed him doing when you all entered, so that might be a daily homework assignment. We'll have to iron that out with the class representatives as we go to streamline the process as much as possible, but my personal goal is to have all of our hero course students be able to cast a few different capture-based spells at a minimum before the end of the year. He looked towards Izuku as he finished his statement to see if it was possible. Izuku thought for a moment and nodded. Doable. Might be a little tough for some of them if they aren't too good at studying or meditation, but still achievable. If I recall correctly, most apprentices start out by learning offensive spells as they're easier to pick up and concentrate on in battle, but since I'm pretty sure law enforcement would look unfavorably on criminal death rates spiking from inexperienced mages throwing around spells they aren't fully capable of controlling, I agree that the first-year spell courses should be detainment spells. Or maybe support spells. We'll workshop that to see if enough people want to learn how to heal. Most people cringed a bit when he mentioned death rates spiking but were put at ease as he finished speaking and took on thoughtful expressions when the healing was mentioned. Which was a good thing in Izuku's opinion. There could always stand to be more healers. Excellent. Nizu said as he clapped, "You're correct that I would like to get a few people to learn healing magic as well, but I don't know nearly as much about the subject as I would like, so I'll have to ask you to speak to me for the lesson plans later." The meeting continued for a short while longer as the morning classes were starting shortly and Izuku waited behind to speak to Nizu about his class times. Turns out he was going to be teaching most of the day. At UA Heroics was a 4-year course and with 2 separate Heroics classes for each year, that's 8 classes per day. He joined a small group of new instructors as they walked towards the first class of the day, 4A's Heroics lesson. The teacher was a man wearing a strange hat that Izuku was sure he knew from before he went to Azeroth but now couldn't tell you the name of, but he had 2 pistols on his belt so he assumed this was Snipe. Maybe he should have paid more attention during the introductions just now. Unfortunately Mirko wasn't with him for this class, but that's okay, he's sure they'll have a class together at some point. Time to wow these kiddos. Oh. They're all 3 years older than me. Whatever, still kiddos. "Hello class," the man said with a strange accent. "Morning Professor Snipe," came the reply. "Settle down. I know you're all itchin' ta get ta the field for the lesson and all, but we got some forms fair you all ta sign beforehand. Don't gimme that look. It's by order of the dean. You have 5 minutes ta read through it, sign it, and pass it down ta me again. Please hold all your questions for later, we're pressed fair time as it is," he drawled as he passed a stack of the confidentiality agreements to the class. "You'll notice these are pretty standard fair NDAs. Over the course of your time as heroes you'll run into them on occasion, so it's best ta be getting used ta it now." Izuku was getting used to the man's accent now. It was kind of similar to the trolls to be honest, though a little more drawl to it, kind of sounds a bit smoother really. He was broken out of his thoughts when a short girl with long periwinkle hair's hand shot up while she bounced in her seat staring at him. He could feel the sigh that just came from Snipe. "Miss Hato, I asked you ta hold your questions fair now." She evidently didn't have the capacity to hold back though. "I know Professor, but who are the new people and why is an underclassman with us? Is he a teaching aide? Can I sign up to be a teaching aide? Oh, I like your hair, it looks fluffy, how do you take care of it? Is it naturally green or is that your quirk? That's a cool hero costume. Does it help with your quirk? Are you here to learn as an exchange student?" Thankfully the redhead sitting next to her clamped a hand over the girl's mouth before she could continue. Snipe facepalmed a bit before looking his way. "Well Archmage? Feel like answering any of those questions now or you wanna wait?" He was still on the fence about his codename. He wasn't quite sure how the other Archmages would feel about him using his title as a codename, but he couldn't come up with anything on his own, so it's a moot point. "I'll answer a couple really quickly so I don't eat up too much of your class time then. Mississippi Hato, I think? I'm not an underclassman, I'm a new teacher. I'm here to assist in the Heroics course and teach a class of my own whenever we get the schedules fixed up. Thanks for the compliment, I like my hair too. Finally, no, it has nothing to do with a quirk, it's just naturally green and I also like my gear, made a lot of it myself." He nodded to the girl and waved a hand at Snipe to signal he was done. The students passed the signed forms back up front and made their way to the changing rooms to suit up while the teachers got settled into ground beta for the lesson. Turns out the class was going to be doing some strange form of capture the flag, where the teams were randomized and property damage was to be kept to an absolute minimum. For some reason Snipe actually physically gestured to several of the students when he mentioned that last part. It didn't take long for Izuku to figure out why. These people would make excellent sapper squads. By the end of the class there were 2 broken bones, several sprains, and multiple lacerations and bruises. Not to mention no less than 7 buildings totaled and a dozen more with minor cosmetic damage. He really hoped these kids would improve more by the end of the year. That's a lot of unnecessary damage. He shook himself out of his musings as Snipe glanced his way. "All right class, my time to shine," he shouted as they got up and came towards him, helping those with mobility issues get to him safely without exacerbating their injuries. That was honestly more than he was expecting. He'll have to re-evaluate these kids then. "So part of my expertise is as a fully trained, licensed, and experienced combat medic. I'm going to teach you guys some basic battlefield triage so that the people you're rescuing come out better than otherwise. This is also going to be touching on the reason you all signed those NDAs earlier." He then spent half an hour pointing out how certain injuries should be treated on the field and point out where medkits most of them were carrying were lacking. He couldn't figure out why people with 3 full years of experience as heroes weren't already carrying medkits, but he'll straighten them out real quick. Then as he put the finishing touches on the last few bandages, he stood up and moved back to the two people whose bones he reset earlier and splinted as a demonstration. Gather round. What I've shown you all so far is how you'd treat these various injuries without using any special equipment or abilities. Now I'll demonstrate how a Mistweaver would do it, he said once everyone had gotten closer. He ignored the looks of confusion at the title and began casting a few renewing mists and focusing on the broken bones with Vivify. The students and the other teachers were enjoying the light show apparently as green lights and mist was generated and began twisting and weaving between the students, and two larger waves of mist focused on the two most injured. The injuries that were still visible were disappearing at a rapid pace and very quickly were gone altogether, and the mist around those people moved to more injured students. Within 10 seconds the mist dissipated and the entire class was staring at their previously injured limbs in awe and unwrapping the bandages to find clear, unblemished skin. They all managed to look back towards Izuku, who was currently drinking a cup of tea that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, something Snipe seemed to take offense to if his muttered, "Not another one," were to go by. Izuku was about to explain himself when Miss Hato literally neumed into his personal space. "That was so cool. How did you do that? Is your quirk just for healing or can you do other stuff with it? Why is it green? Is it just because your hair is green? Did you train with Recovery Girl?" He very carefully moved her own arm into her mouth and took half a step back to get a moment to speak. "Okay, so first off, personal space. I don't want to alarm you or anyone else here, but I've been on active battlefield since I was 12 and it's sometimes difficult for me to not lash out at close fast-moving targets or people who come up from behind," he began. Seeing as most of the people were alarmed at the battlefield thing, he decided to give a little information and ignore the rest. "I have participated in 4 separate wars. The first conflict I entered was when I was 12 and it's where I got a lot of my initial training as a combat medic." Somehow that didn't seem to help as the questioning looks became even more concerned. "Anyway, to answer your questions. I appreciate the compliment. I worked hard on it for years. But I do need to correct you. My quirk isn't a healing quirk." At this everyone was now looking incredulously at him. He has decided that he enjoys that look. In fact, he paused for dramatic effect here, really drinking it in. "I don't have a quirk. I am Professor Izuku, or Archmage, your magic instructor." Rumi was trying very hard not to scoff at the PSS' poor attempts at combat she was witnessing. Very hard. She was with Ectoplasm's class at the moment, second years if she remembered correctly, and they were doing quirkless sparring to work on form and practice takedowns. Unfortunately, it seemed like none of these runts had ever taken a martial arts class in their lives before coming to UA. The Fua girl with the ribbons is promising, but that's about it really. She groaned a little when she remembered she was going to have to teach these brats how to fight. She'd really much rather be out kicking some butt. Midway through the third rounds though, she got a welcome surprise when she saw her current person of interest walk into the gym and chat with Ectoplasm. "Stop your spars class, we're going to be giving you a demonstration or two," Ectoplasm shouted, his students meandering over to form not so much a line as a squiggle. Rumi hated all of it. "Alright class, please welcome one of the new professors, Archmage, who will be teaching you first aid and something else. You all need to pay attention to what he says. He has 6 years of experience as a combat medic and 10 years as a medic in general," the multiplying hero said, trying to introduce the green-haired man that had recently taken up space in Rumi's head. She was once again disappointed by the class's lack of enthusiasm, though as only a handful of them were visually paying attention. Hell, she was paying attention. It had been a while since she took her first aid classes and she probably need the refresher. "Good morning, students. As Ectoplasm said, I am Professor Archmage, or Professor Izuku, whichever you prefer. I've been training as a healer longer than most of you knew what you wanted to be when you grew up, and I've been an active participant in 4 separate wars, so listen up and learn what you can. I'm pretty sure that if you fail the first aid exams at the end of the semester, Nizu and Recovery Girl might just commit an unpleasantness upon you," he said, grinning the whole time. Rumi liked that grin. It was nearly as feral as her own. She listened in rapt attention as he spent the next half-hour detailing how to treat various common injuries you might run into if you responded to a disaster area or a fight scene, and demonstrated techniques on anyone who wasn't paying attention to the lecture to force their participation, which seemed to upset some of them for whatever reason. She let it roll off of her for the most part, putting those who didn't take the lesson seriously on a list in her head of those who likely wouldn't make a name for themselves in the future if they even made it to graduation. Izuku cleared his throat as he finished explaining how to reset a bone and splint it for stability until more prepared medical professionals arrived. "That's all the triage I'm going to be teaching you today, so let's move on to something more entertaining," and his grin was back. "Ectoplasm, I saw that you were doing quirkless sparring when I came in. Care to let me join in the demonstrations?" "Oh, it's on, big guy. I don't see why not. we've got 20 minutes until they need to get dressed back in their uniforms and head back to class, their homeroom teacher said. Some of the class seemed annoyed at the prospect of more sparring, but Izuku cut them off. Excellent. I need a good fight if Professor Usajiyama doesn't mind helping out, he asked. And Rumi? Rumi was fucking vibrating. She vanished from where she was standing in the eyes of the students and called out to him from the center of the large mat, "Why are you still over there, you dork? Come fight me." She watched him chuckle and then he also disappeared and reappeared on the mat facing her. She saw out of the corner of her eyes that the runts were finally showing some form of appreciation at the thought of watching two teachers go at it, but she was beyond caring about them at this point. She saw her sparring partner turn to the side to say something to the class, "Watch carefully. Neither of us is going to be doing anything flashy. It's all going to be melee combat. Try to study our moves as best as you can and see what you might be able to emulate for your own fighting style later on. We'll go for 10 minutes and leave the remaining 10 for Professor Ectoplasm to do as he planned." Oh, so it's gonna be an old school type fight, huh? That was just fine for her. No cheap tricks, just pure skill. The two blurred into motion after a quick bow. Neither using their enhanced speed, strength, or reflexes, but both being at their peak physical condition meant that their limbs were difficult to track with the naked eye. The dull thuds and slaps rang out with the occasional shout as everyone watched the whirlwind of combat going on, neither combatant retreating longer than the time it took to jump back in after dodging a hit that couldn't be blocked. If Rumi had the time or energy to pay attention to the students, she might take some pride in how entranced they all were. Even the ones she had already written off couldn't look away. Unfortunately, or fortunately in her case, she didn't and couldn't care less as she was thoroughly enjoying getting lost in the fight. This guy was so much better than her normal sparring partners that it was taking her all to keep up and push back against his onslaught, and she couldn't be happier. Sure, her hormones and instincts were screaming at her, but she was ignoring that for now. Later. Those can be dealt with later. It was with the greatest disappointment that the timer Ectoplasm had set up rang and their 10 minutes were up. She was breathing very heavily and he looked winded but still fully capable of continuing. She realized he had her beat on endurance and technique, but she had him on power, and they were roughly equal in speed for non-enhanced combat, which was actually really surprising to her. Not many people could keep up with her physically, and this guy managed to match her blow for blow and come out fresher than she did. DMN her rabbit quirk and its instincts. Oh, and the hormones. Because God, he was letting off the best. She tuned out the rest of the class time until the end, where she said she'd be in charge of teaching the runts to put up a decent fight, and simply watched him interact with the other instructors for the remainder of the class. When it was over, she grabbed him and dragged him back into the ring after the students left. "One more round, big guy, and the kitty gloves are off this time," she said with her most convincing grin. Sure, her old roommate and occasional sparring partner Ryuko said she looked insane when she smiled like that, but that was irrelevant to her now as she watched him get back into his stance. She didn't even notice that the other teachers were still there watching them get ready, nor did she see the next class being led in, as the only thing she was capable of watching was the fighter in front of her, who returned the same smile her way. The fight this time was cranked up to 20 on a 1 to 10 scale. By the time the round ended, she was on the floor trying desperately to catch her breath with 3 broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder. Izuku was faring a little better with no broken bones, but he definitely took several nasty hits that would definitely turn some gnarly colors in a couple hours. Or they would if she didn't see him covered in green mist for a few seconds before the mist flew over to her and rapidly healed her broken bones and repaired her muscle tears while she reset her shoulder herself with a grunt. She still wasn't getting up off the ground by herself though, way too tired to make the effort, but in the best way possible. Maybe second best. She watched the man hold out his hand to her to help get her off the mat to stretch after the grueling fighting they'd been doing for 20 minutes now, and after blowing a strand of her long hair out of her eye, or at least making the attempt, she took the offered arm and did some mild stretches to prevent cramping up and greeting the class that was still staring at the two of them. She mostly let the questions flow by her, answering a few questions perfunctorily as she was trying her absolute best not to stare at the man smiling next to her with a big goofy grin while covered in sweat that was rolling down his face and onto his pecs or down his arms over the corded masses of muscles, and the smell coming from him was just umph. Okay, maybe she should go take a cold shower. Oh, Izuku had the same idea, maybe she can sneak into his shower. No, too soon. They still needed a real first date. She was getting that first date, damn it. The two walked out of the gym promising to do proper introductions when they were scheduled with the students next time. She absolutely made sure to put extra sway in her hips as she walked ahead of him to the women's faculty locker room and showers, and mentally rejoiced when she heard him swallow and groan a little when she was doing so. She decided that she needed to hear that grunt much closer and louder, and she needed it to happen yesterday. She stripped down while under the water to have most of the sweat washed out of her suit before throwing it into the rapid washer-dryer combo that was standard in the locker rooms nowadays before getting back under the hot water to let her muscles relax for a few minutes and getting clean shortly thereafter. The dryer was done a few minutes later, which lined up perfectly with her finishing toweling off, so she got back into her suit while carefully drying her hair to prevent unwanted snags. She fished around in her duffel bag for her brush and spent a few minutes going through her hair just to make sure and tossing the towel into the previously used appliances before walking back out to join her next class. Who was the next class with again? Sheet. A few hours later. Izuku was finally done getting introduced to all of the classes he was assigned today and had made it back to his parents' home for dinner. He was mentally reviewing the day and couldn't help thinking about Rumi and her. Everything. He knew she had to have been teasing him with that strut after the spars, she just had to be. There's no way she's still single if she walks around like that in such a high-risk occupation like theirs. He was luckily prevented from continuing that train of thought as the front door opened and a tiny green-haired missile hit his legs and broke his concentration. He couldn't help but smile. "Hey Izumi, how was your day, Squirt?" The little girl grinned up at him. "It was great. I got to play with Mommy all day and we went to the store for dinner stuff." "Oh, and what are we having for dinner?" he asked, already infected with his sister's energy. She shook her head and pouted a little. "I dunno. Mommy won't tell me. Quick, hold me up high so I can watch." Izuku simply laughed and did as commanded, hefting her onto his shoulders much to her delight. He had hit a bit of a growth spurt, so he needed to be careful so that she didn't hit her head on the ceiling, but she was enjoying the view. Laughter pealed from Izumi's throat as she commanded, "Onwards, horsey." To the kitchen. The two made their way, in the most flamboyant way possible, to the kitchen, watching their mother working her magic on a large wok filled with fried rice, chicken fried rice to be more specific. Izuku decided to spice things up a bit before she added the meat and put Izumi down on a cleared counter to make a quick portal. "Hold tight, Mom, don't add the chicken meat yet, I'll go get us a treat," he shouted as he ran through the portal. Inko turned the heat down on the wok for a moment as the two of them watched the glowing blue portal for a few minutes before Izuku burst back through holding a platter of cuts of some sort of poultry. Izuku smiled as he put the platter on the counter beside Izumi and grabbed his knife out of his tool pouch along with his favorite self-cleaning cutting board. That enchantment took forever to get right, and chopped up the already cooked meat into appropriately sized chunks and pushing the platter towards his mother again. "That right there is some of my favorite bird meat. It comes from a crane called the carp hunter. It's already been cooked, you just need to add it as you would chicken," Izuku told his mother while wiping down his blade and putting away his tools. "It's really tender and the crane rarely ever moves around, so there's a lot of good meat on them. I just asked one of the grannies I learned to cook from for a few cuts from one she recently finished getting ready for sale." The other two nodded their heads, eager to try the new meat, and Izumi found herself being put back on her brother's shoulders to watch the food being made. All in all, the family of four, after Hisashi got home, enjoyed the new meat and settled down for a movie before bed. Izuku would deny it as many times as necessary if you claimed he fell asleep while watching his sister's favorite Disney movie. He found himself waking up at his usual time with a drooling baby sister laying on his chest. Happy with that being his first sight of the day, he stood up and carried the girl as gently as possible to her room, his old one, and put her to bed properly so he could start his routine for the new day. He walked into the teacher's lounge 3 hours later after a hearty bowl of breakfast noodles. There's never a wrong time of the day for noodles. And freshly showered, he sat at his desk and reviewed the lesson plan for the week that the dean had been nice enough to get to him. He frowned seeing that he'd be overseeing a training exercise with 1A this afternoon, still not quite sure what to think about Katsuki. Was he scared of him? No, not anymore. He had fought beings that could wipe out entire civilizations, set entire races against each other for pleasure, and those who ruled realms larger than Japan more times than he could count. The little boy with the loud explosions who terrified him once no longer held sway over his heart. No. What he's having trouble coming to terms with is that, apparently, Katsuki had been looking after his baby sister and seemed to have changed. He hadn't seen the boy since the USJ incident and hadn't spoken to him in over a decade, but it was very difficult to reconcile the two opposing Katsukis in his mind. He supposed he'd give the young man a chance today and see if he actually had changed or if he needed to be dealt with still. On a significantly more pleasant note, he'd be teaching that class with both Aizawa and Rumi. He respected Aizawa after looking into his work as an underground hero, not so much what he'd heard of the man's teaching method, but he could maybe chat with him about getting help from the Pandaren who helped him as well as the Kyrians who did their best to help him cope with the aftereffects of the war against the jailer. Any time that he could get with Rumi was time he was now determined to enjoy after the fights from yesterday and her obvious flirting. Think of the devil and she shall arrive. He just finished that inner monologue when Rumi sauntered up to his desk and sat on it leaning over to peek at his course schedule. Hey, we've got a class together today, Green. Maybe we can get another fight in at some point, the rabbit girl said with what he now knew was her fighting grin plastered over her face. Izuku chuckled, maybe, or maybe I could take you to a nice place for lunch or dinner and show you around somewhere cool. If you'll spare some time for someone as young as me, he offered with an easy grin on his face while he was screaming internally about trying not to screw this up. Rumi beamed at him. He allowed his inner Izuku to wipe the sweat cascading down his brow at that. I think I could spare a while tonight for dinner. Any dress code? Izuku was delighted now. Calm down, Izuku, don't freak her out. No, the weather should be pretty good there tonight, so you could even go as you are if you'd like. Any food allergies? Rumi shook her head, her eyes lit up. Oh, taking me somewhere casual? I don't have issues with any food, but carrots are always a plus. Don't laugh, I found out about Bugs Bunny when I was 5 and watched all of his cartoons for years. I couldn't stop eating carrots after that, and it has nothing to do with my quirk. Izuku did his damnedest not to laugh at that, he really did, but he couldn't stop the teasing grin. Oh, I would never laugh at the woman with the rabbit quirk liking carrots, how could I? Rumi glared at him for a moment before chuckling good-naturedly. It's fine, but you think I could really go in my costume? I don't like getting mobbed while eating. Izuku shook his head, not a chance of that happening. We won't be staying on Earth. You might get a few looks when we first arrive, but no one is going to ogle you for being a hero. Rumi got up and bounced a few times at that, and Izuku did everything in his power to maintain eye contact. Yes. Finally. I've been waiting to check out one of the other planets you told me about. Are we going to be fighting over there or just walking around town? I'm down for both. Just around town for tonight. Maybe one of the monks wouldn't mind sparring, but I wouldn't count on getting a good fight out of them. I'll be taking you to the place I landed at when I first got to Azeroth. Just for dinner and showing you around the village where I lived for the first year, he said, his eyes lost in the past while he spoke. He totally missed the touched look that spread over Rumi's face, and the blush she hastily hid by turning around and walking towards the door, not forgetting the extra hip sway. I'm looking forwards to it, Magic Man. Text me after school ends so I can figure out when we're leaving. Izuku definitely heard the instructions, obviously, but a good portion of his brain was currently held captive with the hypnotic sway of the woman's hips as she was walking away, so he barely managed to grunt out a reply. Once the door closed behind her, he was able to relax and flopped backwards in his chair, already exhausted for the day. So much so that the slender arms that wrapped around his chest caught him by surprise, and it was only the familiar voice coming from over his shoulder that prevented him from blinking away and removing the threat. My. Someone is moving awfully quickly for having just told us a couple weeks ago that he wasn't sure about relationships yet, said Midnight while gently running her hands over his shoulders. Izuku, now not in combat mode but not yet in the mindset to be bothered by teasing, shot back at her. Have you seen Rumi? I could be an actual monk and still want to ask her out. Not to mention she's a DMN good fighter, and it's been hard for me to find a good sparring partner for the last few years. Namuri, delighted at the honesty, beamed at him. That bunny can get it, can't she? She nodded to herself and nearly missed Izuku's own nod of confirmation before continuing. So, taking her to see the adoptive village? Izuku nodded, still unable to look away from the ceiling while willing his blood to stop racing from the two different stimuli. Yeah. If I'm going to court someone, I'm going to do it right. She's going to get a crash course on who I am and why I'm the way I am, and hopefully she doesn't consider a relationship with someone with my history too much effort. Namuri nodded sadly at that, conceding the point. She shrugged though. It's not like you can do anything about it. You got dealt a shitty hand and had to spend most of your life dealing with problems no one else on Earth can truly wrap their minds around. Izuku thought for a moment and said, well, not exactly. He sent Namuri a look. Technically there's a spell that projects memories onto a surface or an object for others to view. I don't think I need to tell you why I won't be showing some of what I've seen to anyone, but maybe I can use it in classes to explain treatment methods, he pondered as he explained. That's not a bad idea, Sonny, came the unexpected reply of the elderly woman who typically spends all day in her infirmary. You should run those by me first to be sure of the content beforehand, but that could be very useful as a teaching aid. Might even see if you can teach me the spell so that I can let others see some of the more advanced operations I've been a part of. Izuku nodded at her in respect. Of course, Shuzenji-san. The spell isn't too difficult, just a bit mana intensive for beginners. I'll teach you how to gather mana, and in a few months if you meditate for an hour or two a day you won't have any problems transcribing a memory into a crystal for people to watch later. Just Chiodiri, I'm too old for that family name nonsense from a coworker. I am interested in the spell though. When you said surface or object, I assumed to mean it had to be watched then and there. If it can be viewed later, that frees up a lot of time for me. Chio said and gave the young man a grateful grin. Izuku smiled widely. On a surface it's a one-and-done thing, but if we enchant an object you can watch it whenever you want as many times as you want. He then reached into one of his pouches and grabbed a clear rhomboid crystal and let it hover over his hands as he channeled his magic into it for a few minutes. Eventually the blue and white lights faded away and the crystal fell onto his palm again as he held it out to the small group of teachers who had now gathered around to see what they were doing. Now we just point one end at a flat surface and say, play recording. He had just finished speaking when a thin beam of light split into many more on the wall nearby and everyone watched as the image of a quiet village began to form out of the lights. The line solidified and started moving again, producing movement and sound as the people in the room were treated to the sight of a much younger Izuku running down the cobblestone street to a well-made Eastern-style hut where the recording started to emanate smells of cooking foods and the sound of the younger Izuku's voice came through. Granny Jadebreeze. I'm here to learn again, and while most of the staff members smiled at the radiant smile plastered on the boy's face, and Namuri and Ainen cooed at how cute he was, the rest were still taking in the sights, sounds, and smells when a Pandaren walked out of one of the deeper rooms with a kind smile on her face. Welcome back, Izuku. I trust you've been practicing making your doughs. The memory ended there with young Izuku grinning and nodding his head at the elderly woman. He turned to the other elderly woman in the room with him and handed her the crystal and told her to try, and the staff was treated to the same scenes as before. This was huge for them as they all knew Recovery Girl hadn't learned magic before and didn't have any experience manipulating mana. Like I said, you can watch them whenever you want as often as you want in the future. That one can be overwritten anytime too if you know the recording spell. Khadgar used them fairly often when he knew he would need to be away for a while but still needed me to study some spell or another. Izuku said as he got up and made his way to the door. Anyway, class is starting in a few minutes so I need to head out. Have a good morning everyone. The rest of the morning went roughly the same as the previous day, though he did get to have a 20-minute chat with Lunch Rush while helping the man prepare more ingredients for the students. He even gave the man some of the meat from the gators from the Swamp of Sorrows, after testing for poison or contaminants obviously, for the chef to experiment with. It was now 2 in the afternoon and it was the time he was both dreading and looking forward to what was going to happen for the next 2 hours after stepping through the grossly oversized door in front of him. He was taken out of his thoughts though when an entirely welcome slap on the shoulder came from behind as Rumi shoved the door open with a, "Look alive, hot stuff, we got newbies to torture." That was entirely too loud. Well, he never deluded himself with the thought that Rumi was shy before, he wouldn't start now either. He gave her a soft grin before settling it into a more natural smile as they walked into the class with Aizawa sleeping behind the desk and the 20 students for this group of the heroics course watched them. Rumi took charge instantly with a wide grin. "Sup maggots. I'm Mirko or Professor Usajiyama," she nudged him with her elbow here and he didn't miss a beat. "And I am Archmage, or Professor Izuku. The two of us will be joining your usual professor to help out today with our areas of expertise," he said as he watched Aizawa glance at the two of them and slowly, yet still quietly get out of his sleeping bag behind the podium. "Professor Usajiyama here will be teaching you combat techniques and I will be giving you an entry course on first aid and combat triage as well as how to handle victims of certain injuries." At this Aizawa popped up and glared at the students who were already starting to make noise and, no doubt, going to floor them with questions, especially him as they haven't seen him since the USJ fiasco. "Silence. Hold your questions for later, go get changed into your PE uniforms and meet us at the indoor training room Delta for class today. You have 10 minutes. He was already walking out the door when he finished speaking, so Izuku and Rumi followed him out with a quick wave from him as they left. The three of them were only waiting in the training room for roughly 4 minutes before the students started trickling in. Each of them engaged in conversation in small groups that Izuku was already mapping out to see who would work well together in a few exercises he planning to run with Rumi in a bit. When Katsuki walked through the doors he paused for a moment and his eyes zeroed in on the young man. He hadn't bothered to look at him at the USJ and he hadn't shown up at the apartment in the time since he had been back on Earth, something Izumi was upset about, so this was the first time he'd actually seen the boy since he was 7. He looked neutral? He didn't look happy, but he also didn't have that arrogant sneer or the face of rage he had worn so often the year before Izuku left Earth either, so maybe he really had been holding on to a prejudice for no reason. He'd figure it out as they went. Aizawa waited for the last person to arrive, the class representatives if he remembered the roster right, and spoke up when they all formed a line in front of them. "Alright class, we're going to be doing quirkless sparring for the first half hour of class so that Mirko can get a good idea of where you're each at technique-wise, and then we'll move on to the next activity when she's done her part. Rumi tapped her foot here. I'll be honest, I've been underwhelmed so far, but the other classes combat-wise, I'm not expecting a lot from you all. I just want to see who already knows how to throw a punch and we can work from there. Might even convince my friend here to help with a demonstration later if he's feelin' up to it. She had started with a frown and ended with a teasing grin pointed at him. He was going to put her on the mat so hard. And maybe a bed later. With consent, of course. Aizawa ignored the teasing and split the kids into pairs and had them start the spars. It was interesting to see who was more experienced in Izuku's opinion. There were a handful who'd obviously had structured learning at some point, maybe still were, but most of them had no form to speak of. They all had the benefit of being physically fit though, so that's a point in their favor over the typical run-of-the-mill purse snatcher. None of them would have lasted very long at this skill level on Azeroth, but that was an unfair comparison. Rumi obviously didn't find it as interesting as he did and was ready to end the spars after the first 10 minutes when the class had swapped sparring partners 4 times, already aware of who needed to learn what. So she spoke up. I think that's enough, she called out, and Aizawa stopped the spars currently going on. It's pretty clear that 3/4 of you have never had a structured martial arts class before, and that's not gonna fly after this class. She paused as some of the class hung their heads in shame or despair. The girl with the bob of brown hair looked like her world just came crashing down around her for some reason. Listen up. My colleague here, Izuku, is going to be having his classes on Saturdays, so I can't take up your time then. Instead, I'll hang back for an hour each weekday and get you all to follow a structured training regime. It's not mandatory. I'm not going to grade you for it. But if you don't show up, I'm not teaching you during normal class times either. I've got no time to teach brats who refuse to put in the work to learn how to properly kick butt. The same girl with the permanent cheek blushes blurted out, is the extra class gonna cost anything? 'Cause I'm pretty strapped for cash right now and can't afford normal martial arts dojos, while rubbing her arm showing clear signs of insecurity. The frog girl. Azui, he thinks, rubs the girl's back in support. Rumi's frown softened a little at the question. Of course not. I don't need the extra income and I already earn a salary here and work as a hero normally. I just refuse to work in the field with people who can't defend themselves and will only get in my way. Izuku also sent the girl a soft smile at this. Uraraka, right? She nodded hesitantly at him but relaxed after seeing the kind smile he sent her way. If you're having financial difficulties, you can speak with the dean to see if there's anything he can do to help you get by. On top of that, I'm going to be showing you all something interesting on Saturday that you might find a way to monetize if you're feeling industrious and have an open mind. She beamed at him in a way that reminded him of the kind of innocence he's only seen from his sister at this point. Rumi decided there had been enough mushy stuff for now and elbowed him again before jerking her thumb over at one of the mats and raising an eyebrow in request. He wasn't going to say no to that and started walking over and stretching his limbs while removing his cloak. He ignored the staring from the female students and a few of the male students when his physique came into view. He knew he looked good. He worked hard to build his body up to this point and he was proud of it, but they were all too young for him, too inexperienced, too unable to cope with the horrors he'd seen. He'll stick to Rumi unless she stopped showing interest. Speaking of Rumi. She stopped and stared for a few seconds when he was stuffing his cloak back into one of his pouches as she watched his back and arm muscles work. She only stopped staring when Aizawa quietly grunted at her and she snapped out of her trance before jumping over to one side of the mat. Later. You'll get to feel him up later. Alright class, demonstration time. I have studied a few different martial arts myself, and Izuku has been fighting on the battlefield now for over half a decade and training as a fighter since he was 8, so between the two of us you'll hopefully learn something. The two bowed to each other and started their spar, slowly ramping the speed up over time until the 5-minute timer Aizawa had set rang. They slowed down and got their breathing under control for a minute and did some light stretching before addressing the class again, who they just discovered were awestruck at the display. Both of them grinned the exact same way at them. No one had the guts to tell either of them how frightening they were when they did that. Rumi started off again. So there you go. We're gonna see about getting you all to be able to move at least a quarter of that speed by the time the first semester is over. The class deadpanned at that and Izuku couldn't help the chuckle that escaped. She's right, you know. That was all quirkless, so all of you are capable of doing what we just showed you. I expect you all to be able to move at least a third of that speed before you start your second year, without any quirk-based enhancements, he added. The short guy with the purple ball for hair seemed to fall apart here. There's no way that was all quirkless. Normal people don't move like that. Izuku frowned at this and beat Rumi to the punch on this one. No, that was all quirkless. Professor Usajiyama has some secondary mutations in her legs that give her increased muscle density and explosive power for her kicks and movement speed, but she has put in years of effort to be able to spar with people who don't have the same built-in enhancements. As for myself, I most certainly don't have any quirk-based enhancements working in my favor. The boy didn't let him finish. Bullshit. You were moving faster than she was at the end. There's no way you weren't relying on your quirk for that. Aizawa was going to step in here, but Izuku raised a hand in the universal sign for, "Don't bother, I got this. I wasn't relying on a quirk for that fight. I can't rely on something I don't have." Mineta. The class, or at least the ones who hadn't heard his conversation with the villains that day, gasped at this. Most wearing the same look of disbelief at his admission. Since I don't have a quirk to use for enhancing my physical abilities, that spar was entirely quirkless. Your own regular teacher here wouldn't have any trouble keeping up with that speed either. He nodded towards Aizawa, who returned the gesture. Eraserhead here is a fantastic hand-to-hand fighter, and he also doesn't have the ability to use his quirk to enhance his body. What's your excuse for him? Mineta, and in fact the rest of the class, was stunned into silence at this point. Slowly one of the taller boys, Sato he thinks, raised his hand. "Professor Archmage, with you being quirkless, how were you functioning on the battlefield? I don't mean any disrespect, I just want to know what I can learn from you, sir." Izuku, used to being looked down on due to his age on the battlefield, didn't take the subtle jab at his capabilities seriously and responded, "I am one of the most accomplished fighters you'll likely ever meet. Not only that, but my expertise in medicine, healing, and first aid is enough to get me a job in any hospital in the country at any time. I also have other methods of combat I'll be showing you all when the weekend rolls around, so let's leave that for later." He nodded back to Aizawa to pass the buck back to him as he stepped back behind the tired man with Rumi. Rumi gently grabbed his shoulder and spoke quietly to him, "Don't worry about the kid, he doesn't know what you can do or what you've been through." He appreciated the gesture, but he was long past letting that sort of thing get to him. He's long known he was powerful in his own right without having a quirk of his own. Still though, he laid his hand over hers on his shoulder and flashed her a soft smile and mouthed a quick thanks at her before focusing back in on the lesson. Aizawa spent the next hour with the class going over when to engage, what to look for in an active crime scene, and how to respond to different kinds of emergencies before he gestured to Izuku again to have him take over again. Izuku stepped forward and shrugged his shoulders to loosen them up. "All right, on to first aid. First on the list, how many of you have included a first aid kit in your costume?" he asked, and watched as only half of them raised their hands in response. Why don't you all have a first aid kit? It's the most useful piece of equipment for a hero to have on their person at any given time. You don't even need a full kit, but all of you should be carrying bandages, gauze, expandable splints, and iodine at the very least. I'd suggest getting a full kit, complete with stitches that recovery girl and I will teach you how to use, and several rolls of medical tape and alcohol for cleaning and disinfecting wounds on the fly. Regardless, I'll work with you all over the course of the year to get the basics down so you don't go onto the field making injuries worse for the victims you're there to save. The rest of the day went about as well as it could have gone, with Izuku's mind unable to concentrate on anything but his date that was only an hour and a half away. He was about to make his way out of the teacher's lounge to head home for the day when the PA system came on and Nizu called him into his office. He shook his head and made his way up to the dean's room, where the Chimera was waiting for him with a cup of tea already placed on the desk by the chair he was obviously meant to sit in. "Good afternoon, Izuku," the mammal said, obviously excited about something. "I called you in before you left to inform you of the teacher's dorm we were working to set up for you being ready for use." This caught Izuku by surprise. Sure, he knew they were working on getting him a room to use on campus and all, but he kinda forgot about it. With how hectic the last few weeks had been, he didn't give his lodging a thought and had just been sleeping on the couch at his parents' place. He nodded. "That's great. As much as I want to spend time with my family, the couch is not good for my back." He chuckled at this. "Poor Izumi is gonna be so upset, but I'll be sure to visit her after classes as often as possible to make up for it." The dean nodded in understanding before sliding a key card towards him. "There's your key. The place is with the rest of the staff housing on campus. Ask one of the faculty for directions if you haven't already found them. We've furnished the place with the standard appliances we set up for all of the faculty and provided basic ingredients in the pantry, but you'll have to go out and buy your own ingredients from now on. That's really all I had to tell you for the day." The Chimera then smiled wider. "I hope you enjoy your date with Miss Usajiyama this evening, and remember, UA has an excellent maternity-paternity benefit package." Izuku did his absolute best not to spew the mouthful of tea he was currently enjoying at this, but he couldn't stop the blush that ran from his collarbone up to his hairline. He coughed a few times before downing the rest of his tea, thanking the dean profusely for his time and rushing out the door into a portal he opened up into the living room of his parents' apartment on the fly, eager to get out of that uncomfortable conversation. He was steadying his breathing before he felt someone lightly poking his back and spun around to see his mother looking at him with her mouth smiling, but her eyes had a glint in them that he didn't recognize. "So, Izuku, what's this I hear about you having a date tonight?" she said to him, her friendly smile stretching into a far more teasing grin while his little sister Izumi bounced up and down on the sofa behind her to stand as tall as she could with her hands on her hips as she chimed in with her own teasing. "Big brother is going on a date already?" she asked with a pout on her face. Izuku was stunned, words failed him for several seconds while his mother continued to poke his chest to see if he would spill any details. Eventually his mouth started working again and he blurted out, "How did you know I was taking Rumi out tonight?" He slapped his hands over his mouth at this, but the damage was already done. "Oh, her name is Rumi, huh? That sounds like the name of that wonderful Usajiyama-san who helped you with the former head of the HPSC. You wouldn't be referring to her, would you?" Inko prodded now that she smelled his weakness. Izumi bounced again. "Yeah. The rabbit woman," she shouted before giggling. All he could do was sputter out random noises that might have passed as a language somewhere in the universe, but it certainly wasn't Japanese. Inko decided to keep up the offensive. "Now I have no issues with the woman. She sounds nice and she has already helped you out, so that's a plus for me, but," she said as she poked him much harder this time and left her finger digging into the center of his chest, "just so you know, I don't want grandbabies so soon after you've returned and Izumi is too young to be an aunt," she finished with a predatory grin plastered all over her face, clearly relishing in her son's embarrassment. Izuku shut down for 10 minutes at this. His mother took pity on him and got him up and moving again, if only to get ready for his night out. He had a quick shower and got dressed again in his best casual clothes, which his mother had gotten for him since he was entirely content with filling up a new pouch with shorts and GG shirts rather than stuff that actually looked good on him. Eventually he came out wearing blue jeans and a black t-shirt with one of his new pairs of sneakers that were white and black. His hair had been trimmed in the last week into an undercut which he could agree made keeping his hair out of his eyes while fighting much easier, but was still longer than the buzz cut that Khadgar had insisted on for the first 4 years they traveled together for. He played with Izumi for nearly an hour before he got a text from Rumi about where to pick her up at, and, seeing as he had passed by the place once or twice before, he told her he'd be there in a minute and told his parents and sister goodbye for the night and stepped through a one-way portal to the spot she told him to pick her up at, which just so happened to be right in front of a park bench where she was currently sitting back relaxing with her eyes closed. He was going to greet her, but he was currently stuck admiring her. She had decided against going in her hero outfit and was instead wearing a pair of low-riding distressed jeans with black sneakers and a white long-sleeved blouse that stopped just above her abs and a small beige sleeveless jacket. God, he could grate cheese on those abs. He brought his eyes back up to her face, intending on letting her know he was here, when he noticed she was staring right at him with her usual predatory grin. "Like what you see, Magic Man?" she said as she wiggled her eyebrows. He coughed to clear his throat and turned his head to the side momentarily to clear the blush that had popped up while he was checking her out. He looked back at her a moment later and replied, "Very much so. If I'm being honest, I was wholly unprepared for how good you look this evening." It was Rumi's turn to blush this time, though she didn't look away and let her eyes roam his form, very much so enjoying how his shirt clung to his entire torso. Clearly someone had gotten him a size too small because it looked like he could shred it with a flex. "Oh, thanks for the compliment, stud." She brought her eyes back up to his and enjoyed how he was still flustered with her checking him out this time. "Never been checked out before?" He shook his head and reached his hand out to help her up and explained, "Plenty of times. The armies of Azeroth are not picky on the genders of the soldiers. I've checked out plenty of women and been checked out by plenty in return," he said as she was pulled to her feet with a little bounce that did things for his brain. "Both of them. It's just that I haven't been around many beautiful women recently since my return to Earth, so I was caught off guard. Anyway, you ready to get going?" he finished while trying to change the subject. Rumi felt a surge of pride knowing that he considered her beautiful. She knew she was, but she was happy he chose that descriptor over other, also accurate words. Still, she was excited to get going, so she nodded her head quickly and grabbed his arm as the portal popped up in front of them. She was pulled gently along with him through the portal as the two entered Honeydew Village and were seen almost immediately by a passing elderly Pandaren who called out to Izuku, and they began walking around chatting and eating the stew he had prepared with plenty of extra carrots and some type of meat that she wasn't familiar with, but it tasted so good that she didn't care. They were making a trip to the Tian Monastery, which is where Izuku started learning to fight, when a loud rumbling resounded in their immediate vicinity and a large reptilian thing came charging at the two of them. "Why is there a stone-skinned basilisk this far north?" Izuku muttered before he charged forward and slammed a spinning overhead kick into the top of its head, just behind the beast's skull and into the spine. The basilisk hissed and flopped around for several seconds before falling flat on its belly, dead. Izuku came to the side of the animal and was examining it for any visible tells that might be able to explain why it showed up here of all places. Rumi walked up next to him and looked at the beast that was now clearly dead and was going to say something, but they were cut off by an elderly voice clearing their throat behind them on the stairs to the temple. They spun around in time to see a Pandaren standing at the clearing at the bottom of the stairs, peacefully watching them with his hands held behind his back. "Ah, Izuku. It's so good to see you again, young one. Sorry about the basilisk." Some of the trainees thought it would be entertaining to lead a pack of them to the monastery as a joke. They had been suitably reprimanded, of course. "I had thought we got rid of the entire pack, but I guess I was wrong. It's a good thing it was you here instead of one of the villagers from nearby or one of our less prepared monks." Izuku smiled and bowed to the elder, Master Stone Fist. "It's so good to see you again. You don't have to worry about this one at least, though if you don't mind I'd like to take the body. I'm running low on basilisk meat and these aren't too difficult to detoxify." Once the master nodded at him, he gestured to Rumi. "This is a colleague of mine, Rumi Usujiyama. She agreed to a date this evening and I was showing her around where I landed. Sorry if we were interrupting anything, we can come back if it's a bad time." Rumi bowed respectfully towards the older man. It was clear to see at the very least used to be a skilled fighter with how he watched her and how he carried himself even just standing still. She reached her hand out for a shake and was only slightly surprised that he took her hand for a quick greeting, not entirely sure if it was an acceptable greeting here. Stonefist looked back to Izuku and he smiled. "You weren't interrupting anything at all, young one. Gaoquan and the High Elder would be happy if you came to visit them and the others wouldn't mind it if you stopped by to say hello either," he reassured them before turning around and making his way back up the stairs as they followed him, Izuku taking a second to put the corpse in one of his pouches to process later. "I must admit, it's surprising to see you here. We weren't expecting to see you again so soon after you brought your sister to us last month. Not that you aren't welcome, of course, it is a nice surprise." Rumi was content to listen into their chat while taking in the beautiful scenery as the sunlight was slowly fading as the night went on. She hadn't ever been anywhere this wild before. The forest was so filled with life, several small animals running and playing around with each other, some recognizable, most not. A small blue fairy dragon had even come up to her and allowed her to pet it for a few moments before flying away to play with another of its kind. All in all, it was one of the most peaceful dates she'd ever been on. Not that she really had that much dating experience before this beyond when she would take Ryuko or Kigo out on the town, but those weren't really dates, per se, more of a hangout with some making out involved. None of them were interested in actually dating each other, they'd already had the conversation before. Kigo was too busy to settle down, Ryuko wanted to find a mate for life and leaned more towards men for that, and Rumi just wasn't super interested in the two of them romantically. She was actually out of her element on this date with Izuku, but she wouldn't change a thing so far, except maybe the wildlife attacking them out of nowhere. The small group had finally made it up to the top of the steps where Izuku grabbed her hand when she stopped moving. "Welcome, Rumi, to Tian Monastery. This is the place where I first started to learn how to fight. It's where nearly every Pandaren of the Jade Forest goes to learn to defend themselves when they're young." She was honestly barely paying attention to what he was saying, just taking in the view of the huge and beautiful temple in front of her. She was gonna need a bit to take it all in. Master Stone Fist seemed to understand. "Take your time, Izuku knows his way around, he can give you a tour when you're ready. Have a good evening you two, I hope you enjoy your night out." He bowed again and left after they returned the gesture. The two didn't get to walk in very far before a group of children gathered around them and started bombarding them with questions such as, "Who are you?" or "Why don't you look like us?" or her favorite, "You here for a fight? I'll take you on." Izuku could only shake his head, knowing he wasn't getting out of the monastery without at least a little sparring tonight. Oh well, at least Rumi seems to enjoy it. Could be a worse place to end a first date.
Okay, sadly the chapter is over, and if you enjoyed the video just leave a like, and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.